Eleanor Bassett had never once been described as the kind of woman who turned heads. She had known this her entire life, not because someone had said it cruelly on a single occasion, but because the world had said it in 100 quiet ways, every single day, from the time she was old enough to understand what the world expected of women like her. It was in the way her aunt adjusted her cousin Clara's collar before Sunday church, while passing Eleanor without a glance. It was in the way the seamstress in the village sighed just slightly before taking her measurements, as if Eleanor's body were a puzzle she had not asked to solve. It was in the way men at the market smiled at her briefly and then looked past her, toward someone else. Always toward someone else. She was 23 years old, and she had never once pretended that this did not sting. She was not the kind of woman who convinced herself it did not matter. It mattered. Of course it mattered. She was human. She had feelings the same as anyone else. But she had also learned, somewhere between the ages of 14 and 20, that there was a difference between what hurt and what defined you. And she had chosen, very deliberately, not to let the world's opinion of her shape become the blueprint of her worth. Eleanor lived in the town of Ashwick, a place that was neither large enough to be exciting nor small enough to be forgotten. It sat between two hills, had one decent market, two churches, a river that flooded every 3 years, and a population of people who had known each other so long that secrets rarely lasted a week. Her family was respectable, but not wealthy. Her father, George Bassett, had worked as an account keeper for a local land merchant for nearly 20 years. He was a gentle, quiet man who read books in the evenings and made excellent tea and believed, sincerely, that his daughters were the finest young women in the county, though he said so with such calm certainty that people sometimes thought he was joking. Her mother, Catherine Bassett, was a different kind of person entirely. She was warm and she was loving, but she was also a woman shaped by the pressures of her time, and she worried. She worried about reputation. She worried about appearances. She worried about what the neighbors thought and what the church ladies whispered, and whether her daughters would find good husbands before they became, as she put it with a shudder, too settled in their ways. She had 2 daughters. Clara, who was 21, was fair-skinned and slender, and laughed like music, and Catherine Bassett was quietly confident that Clara would do well. Eleanor was the elder daughter, and Eleanor, her mother believed with a sorrow she tried very hard not to show, would require something more than beauty. She would need to be clever. She would need to be useful. She would need to make up, in character and competence, what she lacked in the things that drawing rooms rewarded. Eleanor knew all of this. She had never been told directly, but she was a perceptive woman, and she could read a room the way some people read a page. She knew when she was being managed. She knew when pity dressed itself as affection, and she had decided, a long time ago, that she would neither resent her mother for it, nor surrender to it. She simply continued being herself, which was, quietly, a very remarkable thing to do. What Eleanor was, in fact, was extraordinary, in ways the town of Ashwick had no framework to measure. She had read more books than anyone in her household, including her father, which was saying something considerable. She spoke with precision and without performance. She noticed things, a child crying in the market square and the specific reason why, a change in the baker's mood and the likely cause of it, the moment a conversation shifted from pleasant to uncomfortable, and the exact word that had caused the shift. She had a memory like a filing cabinet, and a laugh that, when it came out fully, made people around her laugh, without quite knowing why. She was also stubborn in the particular way that quiet people are stubborn, which is the most unshakable kind. Because it does not announce itself, it simply does not move. She had one very close friend, a young woman named Frances Holt, who lived 2 streets away and worked in her family's small printing shop. Frances was sharp-tongued and fiercely loyal, and had the kind of directness that either offended people or made them feel immediately trusted, with very little middle ground. She was the only person in Eleanor's life who spoke to her without any layer of management or calculation. She once told Eleanor, plainly, that the only reason men did not notice her was that they had been trained to look for the wrong things, and that their failure of vision was their problem, not Eleanor's failure of presentation. Eleanor had appreciated this. She had also suspected Frances was partly right. It was Frances who first told Eleanor about the Duke of Aldenmere. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, and they were walking along the river path that wound behind the old mill, and Frances said it the way she said most things, which was without much preamble and with full confidence in her facts. She said that the Duke of Aldenmere, whose name was William Cavendish, and who was 31 years old, and reportedly sensible, and reportedly very much in possession of both a considerable estate and a considerable mind, was coming to the region for the winter season. His family had an old connection to Lord Ashby, whose property sat about 7 miles from the town. He would attend several social events. There was to be a ball at Ashby House in 3 weeks, and he was, by all reliable accounts, looking for a wife. Eleanor had listened to this information the way she listened to most news, with attention and without immediately deciding what it meant to her. She did not feel her heart leap. She did not feel a sudden rush of hope. She felt, if anything, a mild curiosity, the same way she might feel curious about a new chapter in a book. She asked Frances how she knew all of this, and Frances said her father had printed the announcement for Lord Ashby's household, and she had read every word before boxing it. They walked a little further, and Eleanor looked at the river, which was brown and cold, and moving quickly after the recent rain. She said, "I suppose every available woman in the county will be in attendance." Frances said, "Every available woman, and every unavailable woman who can find an excuse." Eleanor smiled at this, and they kept walking. What Eleanor did not say, what she kept entirely to herself, was that for just one moment, when Frances had said the words, she had felt something. It was not hope exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when you read the first line of a very good book, and you are not yet sure what the story is, but something in your chest tells you it is going to matter. She tucked the feeling away, and did not examine it too closely. She had learned that feelings examined too early had a habit of either inflating or collapsing, and she preferred to let things settle before she looked at them. The next 10 days in Ashwick were something Eleanor could only describe, privately, as a kind of pleasant madness. The news spread the way all news in a small town spreads, which was everywhere, immediately, and with creative additions. By the end of the first week, the Duke of Aldenmere had been described as handsome by 3 different sources who had never seen him, wealthy beyond what was decent by 4 people who were clearly extrapolating, and in possession of a tragic past by at least 2 women who had clearly decided that he required one. Eleanor heard all of it at church, at the market, at the small gathering her mother hosted on Thursday evenings, where the neighbors drank tea and talked with great authority about people they did not actually know. Her mother, Catherine, began planning Eleanor's appearance at the ball, approximately 1 hour after hearing about it. She did not ask Eleanor if she wanted to attend. She stated it as a fact. They would go. Both daughters would go. They would present themselves well. She said this with the energy of someone organizing a military campaign, and the anxiety of someone who suspected the campaign might not go well. She measured both daughters for new dresses. She pressed and pinned and adjusted. With Clara, she worked with happy confidence. With Eleanor, she worked with a visible but silent concern, making small sounds under her breath that Eleanor had learned over the years to interpret as her mother's private language of worry. Eleanor bore all of this with good humor. She did not argue about the dress. She stood where she was told to stand, and turned when she was told to turn, and said yes when agreement seemed the most efficient path. But in the evenings, after the house was quiet and Clara was asleep and her father had returned to his book, Eleanor sat by the window in her room and thought her own thoughts. She thought about what it meant to want something when the world had already decided you were not the kind of person who was likely to get it. She thought about whether hope was a form of courage or a form of foolishness, and she was not entirely sure the two were as different as people claimed. She also thought, practically, that she was not going to the ball with any particular expectation. The Duke of Aldenmere was a man she had never met, and a title attached to a man told you almost nothing about who he actually was. She had met enough respectable men in her life to know that respectability and decency were not the same thing, and enough admired men to know that admiration and wisdom were strangers more often than not. She would go to the ball because her mother wished her to go, and because she enjoyed dancing, and because Frances would be there, and Frances was always better company than most people at any event. What she would not do was try to impress anyone. This was not a decision born of defeat. It was a decision born of something much cleaner. She was 23 years old. She had spent most of those years being found insufficient by standards she had never agreed to. She was, quite simply, tired of performing for an audience that had already made up its mind. If she was going to be in a room full of people, she was going to be in that room as herself, entirely herself, without apology, and without the particular exhaustion of being someone she was not. This was the thought she held that night, as the candle burned low on her windowsill, and Ashwick settled into its quiet darkness outside. It was a small thought, practically. It took up very little space. But it was one of those small thoughts that, in time, turn out to have changed everything. 2 weeks before the ball, her Aunt Margaret arrived from the neighboring town of Crestfield. Aunt Margaret was her mother's older sister, and she was, in the politest possible terms, a woman who believed that her opinions were valuable enough to share with everyone, and frequently enough to be remembered. She had strong views about propriety, about social advancement, about what young women ought to look like and how they ought to behave, and what their prospects were likely to be. Based on a combination of factors, she had developed into something approaching a personal system of assessment. She had been formidably accurate about a few things in her life, which had given her an unshakable confidence in her formidable inaccuracy about many others. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon with 2 bags and a list of recommendations that she had apparently been composing during the journey. She greeted Clara first, with open warmth, and told her she looked lovely. She greeted Eleanor second, with affection, and that particular look Eleanor had seen 1,000 times. The look that contained both love and a kind of resignation, as if to say, here is this person I care about, and here is also this problem. Eleanor, her aunt said, holding her by the shoulders, and looking at her, with the focused attention of a woman taking inventory. Let me have a look at you. Eleanor let herself be looked at. She had practice. Her aunt said nothing specific. She said, we will do our best. She said this, the way you might say it, before a very challenging task, with a briskness that was meant to be encouraging, but landed closer to something else. Eleanor thanked her. She meant it, genuinely, because her aunt was trying, and trying with love, even if the love came wrapped in worry, and wrapped again in the particular assumptions of a woman who had grown up believing that a woman's body was something to be managed toward an outcome. That evening, after dinner, her aunt sat with her mother at the kitchen table, and Eleanor heard them talking, not loudly, but in the way that sound carries in an old house with thin walls when you are not trying to overhear but the words find you anyway. She heard her aunt say that Eleanor was a good girl. She heard her mother agree. She heard her aunt say that the difficulty was the presentation, the figure, the way she carried herself, not with bad posture, nothing so simple as that, but with a kind of ease that people sometimes mistook for a lack of ambition. She heard her mother say she had said the same thing many times. She heard her aunt say that the Duke would surely choose someone from a more established family in any case, and that their job was simply to present Eleanor as well as possible and hope for the best. Eleanor stood in the hallway for a moment after she heard this. She did not feel anger. She felt something more complicated than that, something that lived in the space between hurt and understanding, between grief and acceptance. She understood exactly why her aunt and her mother thought the way they thought. They were women of their time, shaped by a world that had given them very little room to think differently. They loved her. The limitation was not in the love. The limitation was in the world they had been handed, and they had passed it on without meaning to, because that is what generations do. She went to her room. She picked up the book she had been reading, a collection of essays by a woman philosopher whose name most people in Ashwick had never heard, and she read until she was calm. Then she closed the book and looked at the ceiling and said, very quietly, to no one in particular, that she was going to that ball, and she was going to enjoy it, and whatever happened after that would happen after that. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the town of Ashwick, rattling the shutters and pulling the last leaves from the oak tree at the end of the road. The season was turning. Something, though Eleanor could not have named it yet, was about to turn with it. Frances came by the following morning, with fresh bread from her family's kitchen, and the news that she had actually seen a portrait of the Duke in a periodical her father had received. She described him with characteristic efficiency. Tall, she said, dark-haired, serious-looking but not unkind. The portrait showed a man who appeared to be thinking about something other than the portrait, which Frances considered a good sign, because it meant he was not the kind of man who was primarily interested in how he appeared. Eleanor listened to this and ate her bread, and thought that a portrait was a very limited source of information about a person's character, but that Frances's instinct about the thinking about something else detail was probably sound, because Frances's instincts about people were almost always sound. She did not allow herself to build him into anything specific. She let him remain what he was, a man she had not yet met, in a world that had not yet revealed how this particular story would go. She had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do was decide the ending before the story had properly started. 3 weeks remained before the ball at Ashby House. 3 weeks in which Ashwick would hum and buzz and prepare and speculate and worry and plan. 3 weeks in which her mother would adjust her dress at least 4 more times, and her aunt would offer at least a dozen more suggestions, and Clara would float through it all with easy grace and the quiet confidence of someone who had always been told she was exactly the right kind of person. And Eleanor would do what she had always done. She would listen, she would observe, she would go on being herself, with no particular fanfare and no grand declaration, and she would walk into that ballroom, not as a woman trying to be chosen, but as a woman who had, very quietly, already chosen herself. It was not a dramatic resolution, it made no sound, but it was real, and it was hers, and in the end, those are the only kinds of resolutions that actually hold. The dress was green, not the bright, attention-seeking green of a woman trying to be noticed, but a deep, quiet green, the color of a forest at dusk, the color of something that did not need to shout. Eleanor's mother had chosen the fabric 6 months earlier for an entirely different occasion that had never materialized, and when she held it up in the evening light and decided it would do for the ball, Eleanor had agreed without hesitation. It suited her in the way that things suited Eleanor, not because it was designed to flatter her in the way fashion plates imagined flattery, but because it was honest. It asked nothing of her that she could not give. She put it on, and it settled around her, and she looked at herself in the small mirror above her dressing table, and thought, this is a woman going somewhere. That was enough. The morning of the ball was a Thursday, and the ball itself was in the evening, and so the entire day existed in a state of strange suspension, the way days do when the important thing is happening later. Clara woke early, in high spirits, and spent the morning practicing the way she arranged her hair with increasing precision. Aunt Margaret hovered helpfully through every room, offering opinions on small things, with the dedication of a person who needed to be doing something productive. Eleanor's mother moved through the house with a particular controlled energy, straightening things that were already straight, reminding everyone of the time when the time was not yet relevant, and making tea, at intervals that did not correspond to any particular need for tea. Eleanor spent the morning doing what she normally did, which was reading, and then writing in the small leather notebook she kept on her windowsill, and then walking down to the river for half an hour, because the air was cold and clear and moving, and she found that movement helped her think. Francis met her at the bridge, having apparently had the same thought about the air and the river, and the need to escape a household operating at elevated tension. They stood, leaning against the stone rail, and looked at the water, and talked about everything except the ball, which was their mutual and unspoken agreement, because talking about the ball would require them to talk about expectations, and neither of them wanted to do that. Instead, Frances told Eleanor about a letter she had received from her cousin in the city, who was apprenticing with a publisher, and finding it both wonderful and maddening. Eleanor told Frances about an essay she had read in which a woman argued, with considerable elegance, that the entire framework of marriage as it existed was less about love and more about property, and that the two had become so tangled together that people had stopped being able to tell the difference. Frances said she thought this was probably correct, and also that it did not prevent her from hoping that love would turn up somewhere in the arrangement, if an arrangement ever presented itself. Eleanor said she agreed on both counts. The river moved below them. The sky was a pale, clean blue, the kind of autumn sky that felt like a held breath. They stood there a little longer than necessary, because sometimes you need a moment of stillness before the day tilts toward whatever is coming next. They walked back separately, Eleanor going home to find her household in a state of organized chaos that had escalated significantly in the 30 minutes she had been gone. Her mother met her at the door with the dress, freshly pressed and laid across both arms, like something precious, which Eleanor supposed it was. Clara was already at the mirror, having settled on a style for her hair that pleased her enormously. Aunt Margaret was sitting at the table eating a biscuit and directing commentary at no one and everyone simultaneously. The house smelled of lavender and warm iron and the particular sharpness of women preparing for something. Eleanor dressed with her mother's help because the buttons at the back of the green dress were placed in such a way as to make independence impossible. Her mother did them up one by one, and she was quiet while she did it, and the silence between them was not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind that exists between two people who know each other well enough not to require words for everything. When she was done, her mother stepped around to face Eleanor and looked at her for a long moment, and her expression was something Eleanor found difficult to read, because it contained several things at once. There was worry in it, the familiar, ever-present worry, but there was also something warmer, something that looked almost like pride, or the early stage of it, like the sky before sunrise. Her mother said, quietly, "You look like yourself." Eleanor said, "I know." Her mother nodded, and went to assist Clara. They traveled to Ashby House in a hired carriage, 4 of them, Eleanor and Clara, and their mother, and Aunt Margaret, who spent the journey reviewing social strategies with the focus of a general reviewing a campaign. She reminded Clara to smile, but not too broadly. She reminded Eleanor to engage people in conversation, because it was her strength. She reminded them both not to appear too eager or too indifferent. She said that the key was to be pleasant and attentive without being forward, engaged but not presumptuous, interested but not desperate. Eleanor sat by the window and watched the darkening countryside pass, and thought that the instructions her aunt was giving were essentially a recipe for performing a very specific and exhausting kind of invisibility, and that she had spent enough years performing it to know that it had never once worked. Ashby House emerged from the trees as the carriage rounded the long curve of the drive, lit from within, so that every window glowed against the dark sky, and for a moment, even Eleanor, who had been quite deliberately tempering her own anticipation, felt something shift in her chest. It was a beautiful house, not intimidating, not imposing, but genuinely beautiful, the way old things are beautiful, with history settled into every stone. Lanterns lined the path to the entrance, and people were arriving in clusters, women in silk and wool and velvet, men in dark coats, voices rising and mixing in the cold air. They went in. The entrance hall was warm and bright, and smelled of candle wax, and something floral that Eleanor could not immediately identify. A steward took their coats. The sound from the ballroom reached them before they reached the ballroom, a wave of music and voices and laughter, and the particular low hum of a large room full of people in good spirits. Clara made a small, delighted sound. Aunt Margaret straightened her back. Eleanor looked around with the quiet attention she brought to most things, cataloging and absorbing. She noticed the way the light fell unevenly from the chandeliers and created pockets of shadow along the edges of the hall. She noticed that the floral smell was hyacinths, unusual for this late in the season, probably forced in a greenhouse. She noticed the way people moved in currents, gravitating toward familiar faces, the natural geography of a social event. Who knew whom? Who was being guided toward whom? Who was looking for whom, without appearing to look? She did not immediately look for the Duke. This was not strategic. She simply was not yet in the habit of looking for a person she had never met, and in a room this full, looking for someone you could not identify was a task that required more information than she currently possessed. What she did do was find Francis, who was standing near the windows with a cup of something warm and an expression of watchful amusement that Eleanor recognized as Francis's natural state at large social gatherings. Francis greeted her with relief, and they stood together and looked at the room, the way you look at something large and complex before deciding where to begin with it. Francis said, "He arrived about 20 minutes ago. He is over near the east side, the dark-haired man talking to Lord Ashby, tall, looks like he is trying to be interested and not entirely succeeding." Eleanor looked. She found them without difficulty. Lord Ashby was easy to identify, being the host and thus the most visible man in the room, moving with the particular authority of a person in their own house. The man beside him was indeed tall and dark-haired, and dressed simply for a man of his rank, without excessive ornamentation. He was listening to Lord Ashby with what appeared to be genuine attention, though Francis had identified a quality in his expression that Eleanor also caught from across the room, a kind of controlled patience, the look of a man who was capable of being interested, but had not yet been given a reason to be. She turned away and did not stare. Staring was something she had no interest in. "What do you think?" Francis asked. "I think," Eleanor said, "that I cannot possibly form an opinion about a person from 30 feet away based on their profile." Francis said, "Fair, but you notice something." Eleanor said, "I notice things about everyone. That is different from forming opinions. Frances smiled and offered her the warm cup, which turned out to contain cider, and they stood and watched the room, and talked quietly, and Eleanor felt, for the first time that evening, genuinely comfortable. The ball progressed through its expected stages, dancing began, and Clara was claimed for the first set by a young man with an open, handsome face, who appeared entirely delighted by her existence, which seemed to be Clara's general effect on young men. Aunt Margaret found a group of women her age and settled into conversation with the ease of a person who has found her natural environment. Eleanor's mother moved between observing and joining, the way she always did at events like this, trying to be everywhere that was useful. Eleanor danced twice, once with a local farmer's son named Arthur Potts, who was earnest and kind and a serviceable dancer, and once with an older gentleman, whose name she did not catch, but who turned out to know a great deal about agricultural drainage, which Eleanor found genuinely interesting, in a way that clearly surprised him. She ate from the supper table. She had 2 cups of the warm cider. She spoke to at least 7 or 8 people with genuine attention, and left each of them feeling slightly better about the conversation than they had when it started, which was something she did without trying, and often without realizing. What she did not do was approach the Duke. What she did not do was position herself helpfully in his path. What she did not do was arrange herself in a way designed to be seen or noticed or remembered. At some point in the middle of the evening, she found herself alone for a moment near the tall east windows, holding her cup and looking out at the dark garden, where the lantern light reached only a few feet before the darkness took over. She was thinking about something entirely unrelated to the ball, a passage from the essay she had been reading that week. Something about the courage it takes to remain yourself in a situation designed to make you into someone more acceptable. She was turning the idea over in her mind, with the particular pleasure she took in ideas when they were good ones. She did not hear anyone approach. She simply became aware, gradually, that someone was standing a few feet away, also looking out at the dark garden. She glanced sideways briefly, and then looked back at the garden, and then, with the quiet double-take of someone who has just registered something unexpected, looked sideways again. The man standing near the window was the Duke of Aldenmere. He was not looking at her. He was looking out at the garden with an expression that she recognized with a small, private start. It was the same expression she made when she was thinking about something she found genuinely interesting, and the room around her had temporarily ceased to exist. She did not say anything. She turned back to the garden. They stood there in quiet proximity for a moment that lasted long enough to be noticed, but short enough to still be accidental. And then from somewhere behind them, a woman laughed, very loudly, and they both looked back toward the room. He glanced at her then, not a searching look, not a calculating look, just a look, the ordinary kind, the look you give someone who has been standing near you and whom you have just become aware of. He said, "It is quieter here." She said, "It is." He said, "You were looking at the garden as if it contained something interesting." She said, "I was not looking at the garden. I was using the garden as a surface on which to think." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That is a very precise distinction." She said, "Most useful distinctions are precise." Something shifted in his expression, not a large shift, just a small adjustment, like a person settling more fully into a chair, or a person who has been half listening and has now become actually interested. He turned slightly toward her, and she turned slightly toward him, and the ballroom continued making its noise behind them, and neither of them moved back toward it. She did not know yet that this moment would change the entire course of her life. She had no way of knowing that. She was simply a woman standing near a window at the end of a long autumn day, saying what she actually thought, in the company of a man she did not yet know, at a ball that everyone had told her was not really for her. She was simply herself, entirely, quietly, unperformatively herself, and that, as it turned out, was the only thing she needed to be. The music shifted to something slower, and the crowd on the dance floor rearranged itself, and the lantern near the window flickered once in a draft from somewhere, and the two of them stood there a little longer, talking about nothing of great consequence, and everything of quiet importance, and the evening moved around them like water around two stones that have decided, without discussion, to remain exactly where they are. Clara danced her third dance. Aunt Margaret drank a third cup of tea. Eleanor's mother looked around the room with the controlled anxiety of a woman waiting for news that had not yet arrived. And at the east window, in the quiet space between the party and the dark garden, something was beginning, though it had not yet announced itself as anything at all. It was too early. It was too small. But it was real, and it was happening. And in the end, those two facts are the only requirements. She had not expected him to have a sense of humor. This was, she realized later, a failure of imagination on her part, because there was no reason a person of his rank would be without one. But the image the world constructed of men like William Cavendish did not typically include wit. It included gravity and consequence, and the kind of measured speech that communicated authority. It did not typically include the moment when, in response to something Eleanor said about the excessive number of floral arrangements in the room, he said, very quietly, that he had wondered whether the gardener had been paid by the flower. And the way he said it was so dry and so precise that Eleanor laughed before she had decided whether to. A real laugh, the full kind. And he looked pleased in the way people look when they have made a joke and it has landed properly. Not the wide, public pleased of a man performing charm, but the quieter pleased of a man who is genuinely glad to have made someone laugh. After that, the formality that had existed in the first few minutes of their conversation dissolved into something easier. Not informal exactly, because they were both people with enough social awareness to understand where they were, but genuine. They talked about the house. He told her something about its history that she had not known, involving a dispute over a waterway in the previous century that had apparently produced one of the most heated legal arguments in the county's recorded history. She said that property disputes had a remarkable ability to reveal the deepest convictions of the people involved in them. And he said he had thought exactly the same thing during the resolution of his own family's most recent boundary disagreement, which had taken 7 years and taught him more about human nature than most of his formal education combined. She asked him, without intending to, what he had concluded from it. He said, without pausing, that people were most honest about who they were when something they valued was in danger of being taken. She said that this was probably true, and also quite bleak. He said that it was bleak only if you entered every situation expecting goodness, and were repeatedly surprised by selfishness. If you entered expecting complexity, it was merely accurate. She said that was a very lawyerly distinction, and he said he had spent enough time with lawyers to have caught the habit. At some point during this conversation, Eleanor realized that she had entirely forgotten to be nervous. Not that she had been particularly nervous before, because she had arrived having decided not to be. But there was always a kind of low-level awareness, at events like this, of what you were supposed to be doing and how you were supposed to appear. And that awareness had simply gone. She was not thinking about how she looked. She was not monitoring her words for excessive confidence or insufficient grace. She was not tracking the room behind her to see whether people had noticed who she was talking to. She was just talking to a person, which was something she was good at, and she had forgotten, in the machinery of the evening, that she was good at it. He had not forgotten, apparently. He noticed. Not loudly, not with the kind of commentary that would have made the noticing awkward, but in the particular way of someone who has been in rooms full of interesting people without meeting one, and then meets one, and finds the experience clarifying. He asked her a question about something she had said, which meant he had been listening, not in the polite way that people listen at parties, waiting for their own moment to speak, but in the actual way, the paying attention way. She answered honestly, and he responded with something that showed he had understood her meaning, and also had his own thought about it. And so it went, back and forth, like a proper conversation, which it was. Eleanor was not naive enough to think a conversation was a declaration. She was not telling herself a story about this moment, not yet, not during it. She was simply in it, fully in it, the way she was in most things when they mattered, with her whole attention, and without the portion of her mind reserved for managing how she appeared. He asked her name when the conversation had been going long enough that not knowing it was beginning to feel like an oversight rather than a formality. She told him, and he said it once, the way people say a name when they want to establish it rather than merely receive it. She said his name too, because she knew it, and because there was no point in pretending otherwise. He smiled slightly at that, the knowing already quality of it, and she said that she lived in Ashwick, and he had arrived with some public notice. And he said that he had found that public notice attached to him wherever he went, with a reliability he had largely stopped trying to manage. She said she could imagine that was both useful and wearying. He said it was more wearying than useful, on balance, and that was the most honest thing anyone had said to her on the subject of his rank in a room full of people who were responding to that rank with tremendous enthusiasm. They were interrupted, eventually, as they were always going to be. A man Eleanor did not know came and claimed the Duke's attention for something to do with Lord Ashby and the organization of the supper, and the Duke turned to Eleanor before he turned to go and said, with a directness that she would remember for a long time, that he hoped they would speak again before the evening ended. He said it plainly, as a statement rather than a social nicety, and Eleanor said, equally plainly, that she would be near the supper table in about 20 minutes, since she was fairly hungry, and he said he would find that useful information, and then he went with the other man, and Eleanor turned back to the window and the dark garden. She stood there for a moment, alone, and she breathed. Then she went to find Frances. Frances, it turned out, had seen everything from across the room, or enough of it to have formed a very detailed impression. She appeared at Eleanor's elbow approximately 30 seconds after the Duke had left, with the expression of a person who has been exercising tremendous restraint, and has now arrived at the moment when that restraint is no longer necessary. She said nothing. She looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back. Then Frances said, "Well." Eleanor said, "We had a conversation." Frances said, "You had a very long conversation, near a window, that involved both of you laughing at least 3 separate times that I counted, and he has not laughed at anything else this evening." Eleanor said she could not speak to what he had, or had not done for the rest of the evening, as she had not been observing. Frances said, "I know. That is precisely the interesting part." Eleanor thought about this. Then she said she was going to the supper table because she was hungry, and Frances said she would come too, and they walked across the room together, and Eleanor did not look for him, and did not look away from looking for him. She simply went to get supper because she was genuinely hungry, and if that happened to coincide with something she had mentioned to someone, then that was a thing that had happened, and she would know what it meant when it showed her what it meant. He found her at the supper table. He came with a plate and stood beside her, and they continued the conversation they had been having, without any acknowledgement that they had stopped it, picking it up from almost exactly where they had left it, which is a thing that only happens when 2 people have been genuinely in a conversation, rather than performing one. They talked through supper. Other people moved around them. Clara danced. Aunt Margaret watched. Eleanor's mother, from across the room, noticed the Duke standing beside her elder daughter, and had an expression on her face that Eleanor, had she seen it, would not have known how to interpret, because it was made of too many feelings at once, and they had not yet sorted themselves out. The evening moved toward its end the way evenings always do, with a slight change in the energy of the room, a gradual quieting, a thinning of the crowd. When it was time to leave, Eleanor gathered her shawl, and found her family, and said the appropriate goodbyes to the host, and moved toward the entrance, with the pleasant tiredness of someone who has had a genuinely good evening, rather than a merely endured one. He found her once more in the entrance hall, not arranged, not theatrical. He was simply there, also leaving, also in the movement of an evening's conclusion, and he said, briefly and without construction, that he had enjoyed the conversation and hoped she would be at the Holt gathering the following week, which he understood was another event on the Regent's calendar. She said she had not yet been invited to the Holt gathering, but that she expected an invitation was possible. He said he hoped it would be, and he said it with the plainness she had come to understand, in the space of an evening, was simply how he spoke, without decoration, and without the performance of sentiment he did not actually feel. She got into the carriage. Her mother immediately said, "Who was that man you were speaking with?" as if she had not entirely worked it out herself, and Aunt Margaret answered before Eleanor could, saying his name and his title, and the entirety of his relevant biographical information, with the speed of a person who had been compiling it all evening, in case the moment ever presented itself, which moment had now arrived. Eleanor looked out the window at the passing darkness and felt, inside her chest, the small, careful warmth of something that had not been there when the evening began. She did not know what it was yet. She was not in the habit of naming things before she was sure, but it was there, and it was real, and she held it very gently for the rest of the ride home. The invitation to the Holt gathering arrived on Saturday morning, 2 days after the ball. It came in a plain white envelope, addressed to the Bassett household, requesting the pleasure of the family's company, at a small supper, and music evening at Holt Manor the following Thursday. Eleanor's mother read it twice before she said anything, and what she said, when she did speak, was carefully constructed to sound like simple information, while carrying the full weight of everything she was trying not to say directly. She said it was kind of the Holts to have thought of them. She said it was a smaller event than the ball, and therefore more intimate, which would be either pleasant or awkward depending on the composition of the guest list. She said nothing at all about the fact that prior to last Wednesday, no one in the Bassett household had received an invitation to anything at Holt Manor in living memory. Aunt Margaret was less restrained. She arrived in the kitchen before breakfast, with the look of a woman who had spent the night developing a theory and was ready to present it. She said it was not coincidental. She said that invitations like this did not simply appear. She said that something had clearly occurred at the ball, and that it was worth discussing carefully and sensibly before anyone read too much into it. She then spent the next 40 minutes reading a very great deal into it, thoroughly and with enthusiasm, while Eleanor ate her toast, and Clara listened with wide, delighted eyes, and their father read his book in the next room, with the quiet peace of a man who had learned when not to enter a conversation. Eleanor said very little, not because she had nothing to think about, because she had thought about quite a lot since the carriage ride home, lying in bed in the particular wide-awake way of someone who has had an evening that has given them too much material for sleep. She had thought about the conversation by the window. She had thought about the supper table. She had thought about the way he had spoken, the directness of it, the absence of performance, the quality of his attention. She had thought about what Francis had said, that he had not laughed like that at anything else all evening. She had turned all of it over carefully, the way you turn a thing in your hands to understand its weight and shape before you decide what to do with it. What she had concluded, by the gray hours of early morning, was that she did not yet have enough information to conclude anything. A conversation was a conversation. A pleasant evening was a pleasant evening. Men of his position spoke with many people at many events, and the fact that he had spent a portion of one evening in her company did not necessarily mean what her aunt was already constructing it to mean. She was not going to allow hope to run ahead of evidence. She had learned, from years of being the person the world underestimated, that the particular cruelty of hope was not in hoping, but in hoping prematurely, in building something large before the foundation was confirmed, and then feeling the collapse as a personal failure when the building fell. She went to see Francis that afternoon. Francis was behind the counter of the print shop when Eleanor arrived, sorting type with the focused efficiency of a person who had been doing something long enough to do it without paying full attention. She looked up when Eleanor came in, and without preamble she said, "Thursday." Eleanor said, "Yes." Francis said, "My family received one too. I checked the list. There are about 18 guests." Eleanor said, "That is a small list." Francis said, "It is a deliberately small list. The Holts do not do things by accident. They have been hosting social events in this county for 30 years, and they know exactly who they are inviting and why." Eleanor said that this was probably true, and that the most sensible interpretation of it was that Lord Ashby had mentioned them to the Holts, as the families were connected, and the Holts had been polite enough to extend an inclusion. Francis looked at her with the expression she reserved for Eleanor's more cautious moments. She said, "Eleanor, he told you he hoped you would be there." Eleanor said, "He said he hoped an invitation was possible. That is not the same thing as engineering one." Francis said, "Is it not?" Eleanor had no definitive answer to this, so she picked up a small printed broadsheet from the counter and looked at it. It was a notice about a local fencing dispute. She read it carefully and then put it down. She said, "I am not going to expect anything." Francis said, "That is an entirely different thing from going, though." Eleanor said, "I know." The week between the ball and the Thursday gathering was a week unlike most weeks in Ashwick, in that it had a quality of anticipation that pressed on everything slightly, like a thumb held lightly against a page. Eleanor went about her usual days, her reading and her walking and her occasional help in her father's account-keeping, and she helped her mother with the household, and spent an evening teaching Clara to do a particular embroidery stitch Clara had been wanting to learn. She was present in all of these things in her usual way, but underneath the usual days there was a current she could feel, moving. She thought about him more than she intended to, not in the elaborate, constructed way of a woman composing a fantasy, but in the specific way you think about a conversation that was interesting, and that you have not finished processing." She returned to particular moments. The way he had said she was making a very precise distinction, and the quality of his voice when he said it, which was not mocking but genuinely appreciative. The way he had taken her observation about the supper table and turned it into the beginning of a longer thought. The fact that he had asked questions rather than talked, which was, in Eleanor's experience, a quality that was rarer than it should have been in people who had reasons to feel important. She did not share these thoughts with her aunt, who would have amplified them beyond what Eleanor could manage. She shared a little with Frances, who received them with appropriate calibration. She shared nothing with her mother, not because she did not trust her mother, but because her mother's worry would have immediately transformed whatever Eleanor said into something that required managing, and Eleanor did not want it managed. She wanted to hold it as her own thing for a little longer. Thursday came with a fog that lifted by mid-morning, leaving a sky that was thin and pale but clear. Eleanor wore the green dress again, because it was her best, and because she saw no reason to pretend it was not. Her mother had pressed it freshly and hung it the night before, and she helped Eleanor into it again without comment, and this time, when she finished the last button, she did not step around to look at Eleanor. She simply put her hands on Eleanor's shoulders from behind and held them there for a moment, and Eleanor put her hand over her mother's hand, and they stayed like that for a second or two, and then her mother said they should not be late, and they separated. Holt Manor was smaller than Ashby House, but older, with low ceilings, and rooms that had the deep warmth of wood-paneled walls, and a fire that had clearly been going for several hours before the guests arrived. The Holts themselves were a couple in their 60s who hosted with the ease of people who genuinely enjoyed company and were secure enough in their own lives to allow their guests to enjoy themselves however they chose. Mrs. Holt greeted Eleanor with particular warmth and told her it was lovely to finally make her acquaintance, which Eleanor received with interest since she had not previously been aware that making her acquaintance was something Mrs. Holt had been hoping for. The guests arrived over about 20 minutes, and Eleanor greeted Frances when she came in, and stood with her near the fireplace, and looked at the room as it assembled. The company was indeed small, as described, and felt genuinely curated, rather than simply gathered. There were a few families she recognized from the ball. There were two women she had never seen before, one of whom turned out to be a cousin of the Holts visiting from the north. There was an elderly man with a remarkable quantity of white hair, who had, according to Frances's whispered report, translated 4 books from Latin, and was currently arguing with the local academic establishment about the dating of a particular Roman settlement. And there was William Cavendish, Duke of Aldenmere, standing near the bookshelves on the far wall, with a drink, and the look of someone who had arrived recently, and was taking his first survey of the room. Eleanor saw him before he saw her. She had a moment, which she used to settle her own breathing, which she had not been aware had changed, and then she moved with Frances toward another part of the room, and began a conversation with Mrs. Holt about the garden, which Mrs. Holt was passionate about, and which Eleanor found genuinely interesting. He found her 20 minutes later, which she was aware of in the way that you can be aware of someone approaching without looking at them, the slight shift in the spatial awareness of a room. He came to where she was standing, now alone, having just said goodbye to Mrs. Holt, who had gone to greet a late arrival, and he said, "You were invited." She said, "So it appears." He said, "I am glad of it." She said, "You said that at the ball." He said, "I meant it then too." This was such a direct statement, delivered with such complete absence of social cushioning, that Eleanor looked at him properly for the first time that evening, and found that he was looking back at her with the same complete attention she had noticed at the ball. She did not look away. There was no reason to look away. She said, "Why?" He said, "Why what?" She said, "You are a man with considerable options for company. Why is it worth saying twice that you are glad of mine?" He considered this for a moment, and she had the impression of a man who was genuinely thinking, rather than selecting from a prepared set of answers. He said, "Because I have spent a significant number of evenings in rooms like this one, and I find that the quantity of genuinely interesting conversation I encounter in them is substantially lower than it should be, given the number of people present." She said, "And you believe I provide the exception?" He said, "I believe you might. I do not have sufficient evidence yet." She said, "That is a very fair answer." He said, "I try to be fair." She said, "Most people try to be charming instead." He said, "Yes. I find it less useful." They moved together to the chairs near the window, not by agreement, just by the natural drift of two people who have decided that the conversation they are in is the one they want to be in. Eleanor sat, and he sat across from her, and the party moved around them, and they talked. This time there was less of the exploratory quality of the ball, and more of the comfortable, extending quality of a second conversation, the particular pleasure of picking up a thread you had left somewhere, and finding it still there, still holding. He told her about the estate he managed, Aldenmere, which was in the north, and which he described with the particular combination of affection and exasperation reserved for things you are deeply responsible for. He said it was beautiful, in a way that you could only fully appreciate when you were standing far enough away from the drainage issue, or the disputed tenancy, or the roof repair that had been postponed for a decade. She asked him questions that showed she understood something about land management, which surprised him, and she explained that her father had worked in accounts for a land merchant, and she had grown up with the language of fields and boundaries and seasonal yields. He said, "You grew up understanding something most women of your age and position were not expected to know." She said, "My father talked to me as if I was interested. I became interested." He said that this seemed like a very good system of education. She said that it had worked rather better than the alternative she had been offered, which included a finishing program at a school that had specialized in teaching young women to enter rooms gracefully and arrange flowers, neither of which had seemed, at the time or subsequently, to be the most important skill available. He laughed at this, the full kind, the kind Francis had noted, and the elderly translated man across the room looked up from his conversation with mild curiosity at the sound of it. The evening had dinner in the middle of it, at a long table set for 18, and Eleanor was seated 4 places from William, which was close enough to exchange a glance across the table on 2 occasions, and not close enough for sustained conversation, which was perhaps appropriate. She talked to the person on her left, who was the visiting cousin from the north, and who turned out to have very strong opinions about the wool trade, and to the person on her right, who was Mr. Holt himself, who told her 3 stories about the house's history, that she filed away with genuine pleasure. After dinner there was music. A young woman played the pianoforte with real competence, and the company arranged itself in the natural way of a room that has moved from eating to listening. Eleanor found a seat near the back where she could both hear the music and see the room, which was her preferred position at these things. He came and sat 2 chairs away from her, and they listened, and neither of them said anything, because the music was good, and conversation would have been an interruption. But at some point, during the second piece, without either of them appearing to plan it, they had leaned slightly inward, the way 2 people do when they are close enough to speak quietly, and are comfortable with the possibility of doing so. They did not speak, but the lean was there. It was small, and it was real, and it was something, though she still could not say precisely what. When the evening ended, and the coats were retrieved and the goodbyes were said, he found her once more in the entrance hall, and this time he said he would be in the region for another 3 weeks at least, and that there were 2 more events on the calendar, and he said that he hoped she would attend both. He did not pretend to be making a social observation. He said it as what it was, which was a direct and honest expression of a preference. She said that she would likely attend both, and that she found it useful to know the calendar in advance. He said he would make sure she was informed. She thanked him. She went home. She did not say much in the carriage. Her mother did not push. Her aunt said several things, all of which swirled in the air of the small carriage, and then dispersed, without Eleanor catching them. Clara fell asleep against the window. The fog had come back with the dark, and it pressed against the carriage glass in soft, shifting shapes. She thought, on the way home, that something was happening. She did not yet know what it was, or where it was going. She did not know whether she was at the beginning of something or merely in an interesting parenthesis in an otherwise ordinary life. She was still not ready to build it into anything large, but she allowed herself, for the first time, to feel the warmth of it without immediately trimming it back to manageable size. It was enough, for now. It was more than enough. She looked out at the fog, and she held the evening carefully in her chest, and she let herself be glad, quietly and without permission, and that gladness was real, and it was hers, and she was not going to apologize for it to anyone. Not to the world, not to her aunt, not to the voice inside her own head that had spent so many years reminding her to be reasonable. She was going to let herself feel it, and in the morning, she would see what it looked like in the daylight. The morning showed her something clear. She lay in bed for a while before rising, watching the thin light come through the curtain, and she thought about what she actually wanted. Not what she was supposed to want, not what was sensible or likely or advisable, but what she, Eleanor Bassett, 23 years old, woman of Ashwick, daughter and friend and reader and walker and quiet observer of everything, actually wanted. She found, when she was honest with herself in the stripped-down way that early mornings make possible, that she wanted to know him, not to catch him, not to secure him, not to make him into the resolution of some story she had been assigned. She wanted to know who he was. She was curious about him in the genuine way, the way she was curious about books she had not yet read and places she had not yet visited. The curiosity that comes from the actual texture of a person, the particular way he chose words, and the things he noticed, and what he thought about when he was not required to think about anything in particular. This was a new feeling for Eleanor. She had been interested in people her whole life. It was one of her most constant pleasures, but she had not felt this specific kind of interest, not this focused on a single person, not this attentive to the question of what they might turn out to be. She got up and made her own tea before anyone else in the house was awake, and she sat at the kitchen table in the early quiet, and she let the thought settle, and when it had settled, she decided that she would simply continue being what she had already been, herself, honest and present and paying attention, and she would let whatever came next come next, and she would not try to manage it into something before it was ready. It was, she thought, the only approach that had ever worked for her in anything, and she was not going to change it now. The talk started on a Monday, 6 days after the Holt gathering. Eleanor knew it had started, because Frances told her, with the particular directness Frances applied to news she thought Eleanor needed to hear, and would prefer not to. They were in the print shop again, morning light coming in sideways through the front window, and Frances set down the type she had been sorting and said, "People are talking about you and the Duke." Eleanor said she had expected as much. Frances said, "The version being told most frequently at the moment involves you pursuing him." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I see." Frances said, "It is being described as an unlikely pursuit, with commentary on why it is unlikely." Eleanor said, "Commentary on what aspect specifically?" Frances said, "The usual, appearance, standing. The mismatch, as people see it, between his position and yours." She paused and then said, with precision, "There was also a comment from a woman at the church this morning. A woman whose name I will not give you, because she does not deserve the permanence. That you do not have the figure for a position like his, and that this particular ambition was going to end badly for you, and that someone ought to have a word." Eleanor heard this and sat with it. She did not immediately respond, because she was someone who processed things before speaking about them, and this was something that required actual processing, rather than the quick, surface response that would have been easier to give. What she felt, in the order she felt it, was this. First, a clean and familiar sting, the kind that had never lost its sharpness regardless of how many times she had felt it. Her body was a topic for other people's opinions, and other people's opinions about her body arrived with the particular authority of certainties, as if the shape of her were self-evidently a verdict on what she deserved. She had felt this her whole life. It did not become less painful with repetition. It simply became more familiar. Then, below the sting, she felt something harder. Not anger exactly, though there was some of that. Something more like a quiet, clear refusal. She was not pursuing William Cavendish. She had not engineered meetings, or contrived introductions, or positioned herself at windows for effect. She had gone to a ball because her family attended, and she had spoken to a man who had approached her, and then she had been invited to another event and had gone, and they had spoken again because they had wanted to. She had done nothing wrong. She had done nothing that any other woman in that room had not been there hoping to do. The only difference was that something had appeared to happen in her direction, and because it had happened in her direction, because she was not the expected recipient, the explanation being offered was not that she was interesting or that he was drawn to her, but that she had done something calculated. This was, Eleanor thought, the particular insult reserved for women who did not fit the template. When something good happened to the expected woman, it was because she deserved it. When something good happened to the unexpected woman, it was because she had maneuvered for it. Her result was always suspect. Her presence in the story was always slightly fraudulent. She said to Frances, "What do you think I should do?" Frances said, without hesitation. Continue exactly as you have been doing. Any other response rewards the commentary, Eleanor said. And if it gets worse? Frances said. It will almost certainly get worse before it gets any better. These things always do. Because they feed on attention, and attention takes time to redirect. But you are not doing anything wrong, and you know that, and I know that. And whatever he thinks matters more than what the church morning crowd thinks, and you do not yet know what he thinks. This was practical and correct, and Eleanor appreciated it. She went home, and she did not change anything about the way she spent the rest of the day, which included making lunch, and reading, and walking, and helping her father with a small accounting error he had found in the previous month's ledger. She was herself. She kept being herself. The comments, as Frances had predicted, did not stop. Over the following week, Eleanor became aware of them in pieces, some reaching her directly, and some filtered through her mother, who received them with a protective fierceness she did not always manage to conceal. Her mother came home from a Thursday church meeting, with her jaw set and her movements slightly more brisk than usual, and when Eleanor asked what had happened, her mother said nothing, which meant something had. That evening, Eleanor overheard her mother telling her father, quietly but with feeling, that some people in this town had nothing to recommend them but their own certainty of superiority, and that she would not have Eleanor spoken about that way. And her father said, with his characteristic calm, that Eleanor had always been more than any of them had seen, and that this had always been true, and that what was currently happening only made it more visible, not less true. Eleanor heard this from the hallway, and felt something move through her that was complicated to name, because it was love and grief and gratitude all at once, the particular feeling of being defended by the people who love you against the people who have decided they know your value better than you do. She went to the second event on the calendar that week, a smaller gathering at the home of Lord Ashby's neighbor, a man named George Finch, who hosted a regular afternoon conversation that was, in practice, a kind of informal salon. There were perhaps 12 people, seated in a large drawing room with books along every wall, and the format was loose. People talked about whatever they found worth discussing, and the conversation moved in whatever direction it wanted, which Eleanor found deeply congenial, because it was the kind of gathering that rewarded exactly what she was good at. William was there. He arrived about 10 minutes after Eleanor, and when he came in, and the small group rearranged to accommodate him, he found her without appearing to look for her, and sat in the chair closest to her position, and did not make it into an event. He simply sat down, and they were near each other, and the conversation continued, and they were both in it. She noticed, that afternoon, something she had been aware of at both previous events, but had not yet named. He treated her no differently, in the company of others, than he did when they were alone in a corner. He spoke to her with the same directness, the same interest, the same quality of attention. He did not minimize her in the presence of other people, which Eleanor had seen men do to women they were privately interested in, and publicly embarrassed to be associated with. He did not redirect her observations towards safer ground. When she made a point that the room received with surprised attention, he did not look as though her capability had exceeded his expectations. He looked simply as though something interesting had been said, which it had, and the interest was appropriate. This was not a small thing. Eleanor knew it was not a small thing. She had been in enough rooms, and observed enough dynamics, to know that how a man treated you when other people could see, was one of the most reliable indicators of what he actually thought of you, as opposed to what he was willing to admit to, or display, when privacy removed the cost of honesty. The afternoon salon ended around 5 o'clock, and the guests dispersed into the dim late afternoon light. Eleanor was pulling on her gloves in the entrance, when William found her for what she was beginning to think of as the characteristic moment, the end of event finding, which by now had happened at 3 separate occasions, and had begun to feel like a pattern rather than a coincidence. He said, quietly, so that only she could hear, "There are people in this county who are saying things about you that are not accurate." She paused in the middle of a glove and looked up at him. She said, "I am aware." He said, "I want you to know that I am also aware, and that I find them unworthy of response, and that if it would be useful for you to hear that from someone who is not a member of your immediate family or your close friends, then I am saying it." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "It is useful." He said, "Good." She said, "Why are you telling me this?" He said, because you have not done anything that requires defense, and because I think you probably know that, but I have found that knowing a thing and hearing it confirmed are sometimes different experiences. She did not know what to say to this, which was unusual for her, because she nearly always knew what to say. She finished putting on her glove, and she looked at him and she said, "Thank you. That is genuinely kind." He said it was not a question of kindness, but of accuracy, and she said that accurate kindness was the best kind, and he agreed with this. She went home. She sat in her room in the early dark, and she thought about what he had said and what it meant about who he was. Not about what it meant for her future, or her prospects, or the question that everyone around her was already asking loudly. Those were real questions, and she would have to deal with them in time. But tonight she sat with the smaller, cleaner question of what kind of person said that to someone they had met 3 times, at the end of an afternoon, when no one was watching to calculate whether the saying of it would advantage them. She concluded that he was the kind of person who said true things when they needed saying, without needing an audience for them. She had not known many people like that. She was one of them herself, or tried to be, and she knew how rare it was, and she valued it in the way you value something that you have looked for a long time without finding. The following morning she wrote in her notebook, the small leather one, the one she kept for thoughts she was not ready to say out loud. She wrote about the conversation, and about what it revealed, not about her romantic situation, which she was still not ready to call a romantic situation, but about what it revealed about the nature of people, about how you could be in a room with 100 people, and find one whose way of being in the world matched something in your own understanding, and how that recognition, when it came, was quiet, but unmistakable. She did not write about love. She was too careful for that, too practiced in the discipline of not running ahead of the evidence. But she wrote that she was paying attention, and she wrote that what she was paying attention to was worth paying attention to. Outside her window, the town of Ashwick moved through its ordinary Tuesday with the accumulated noise of a place going about its business. Somewhere in that noise, she knew, were the voices still constructing the story of her presumption, still measuring her against a standard she had never agreed to and finding her wanting. She could hear them distantly, like weather that has not yet reached where you are. She closed her notebook and put it on the windowsill and looked out. The sky was gray and even, the kind of sky that held rain without yet releasing it, and the oak tree at the end of the road moved its bare arms in the slow, impatient way of trees in winter. She watched it for a while. She was not distressed. She was not afraid. She was something harder to name. A woman in the middle of a story, present in it, paying attention, not yet knowing the ending, and choosing, very deliberately, not to be afraid of that. Her mother called from downstairs. There was something about lunch. Eleanor answered, and stood, and went downstairs. And the day continued, and she continued inside it, and the story continued with her. Frances came by on Wednesday, with the news that 3 separate women had independently asked her, at 3 separate locations around the town, whether Eleanor had lost her sense of proportion. Frances had told each of them, in carefully chosen words that were polite in their structure and very clear in their meaning, that Eleanor's sense of proportion was excellent, that it was their own sense of proportion that might benefit from examination, and that she had other things to be doing. Eleanor heard this report and felt grateful for Frances, in the specific way you feel grateful for someone who fights for you when you are not in the room. It was a different kind of gratitude than the kind you feel for someone who comforts you to your face. It was quieter and deeper, the kind of gratitude you do not always find words for, but that sits in you for years. What Eleanor did not tell Frances, because she had not yet fully understood it herself, was that the commentary, as painful as it was, had clarified something for her. Every time someone said she was not the right shape for the life she appeared to be moving toward, she felt the sting, and she also felt, beneath the sting, a kind of rising certainty, not the certainty that things would go as she hoped, because she had no control over that, but the certainty that she was not wrong to be herself, that the self she had been bringing into every room was not a liability, that she had not spent 23 years being overlooked because she was insufficient. She had been overlooked because the people doing the overlooking were using the wrong measure. This was not a new idea. She had held some version of it for years. But it was becoming something more than an idea. It was becoming a feeling in her bones, the kind of knowledge that lives in your body rather than your head, that does not require reminding, that is simply there. She went to the Thursday market in the morning, which she did every week, and she moved through the stalls with her basket, and she spoke to the people she always spoke to. The cheese seller, who had known her since she was a child, and always saved the sharp cheddar because he knew she liked it. The woman who sold dried flowers, and always had an opinion about the weather. The old man near the gate, who grew the best parsnips in the area, and who had once told Eleanor she had the sharpest eyes he had met in someone under 40, which she had taken as the specific and sincere compliment it was intended to be. She was herself at the market, entirely herself, with no adjustment for any audience, and the people around her received her the way they always had, which was warmly, because she was warm, and with interest, because she was interesting, and with the easy familiarity of people who have known you in one context for long enough to feel comfortable. This, Eleanor thought, walking home with her basket, was what it felt like to be known. Not evaluated, not measured, known. She understood more clearly than she ever had, to be known in all the contexts of her life in the same way. Not as someone who had arrived at a position above her natural station, not as someone to be assessed for her fitness, not as someone whose body or background determined her ceiling. She wanted to be known as the person she actually was, in her fullness, in her complexity, in all the things she understood, and all the things she was still working out, and all the ways she was remarkable that the world had not thought to look for. She was not sure, yet, whether William Cavendish was the person she would be known by. She was not sure of very much, in the specific terms that certainty required, but she was sure of herself. She was, perhaps for the first time without reservation, entirely sure of herself. And that, she thought, setting her basket on the kitchen table and calling hello into the house, was the most important thing to be sure of, because everything else, whatever it was going to be, would start from there. Her father found her that evening in the study, which was a room that was primarily his, in the sense that it contained his books, and his desk, and his decades of careful account ledgers, but which had always been shared with Eleanor in practice, because Eleanor had been reading in that room since she was tall enough to reach the bottom shelf. He was sitting at his desk when she came in, not working, just sitting with a cup of tea going cold in front of him, and a look on his face that she recognized as the look he had when he was thinking about something he was going to say. She sat in the chair across from him, the old green one that had been in that room for as long as she could remember, and she looked at him and waited. He said, after a moment, "You are all right." It was not quite a question. She said, "Yes." He said, "I mean that, in the larger sense. Not just today, or this week. You are all right. You always have been." She looked at him. She said, "I know." He said, "I am not sure your mother knows, though she is getting there, and I am quite certain your aunt does not know. But I want to say it plainly, because it is true, and you should hear it from me. You are exactly who you need to be. Whatever happens with any of this, that was always true, and it will continue to be true." Eleanor sat with this for a moment. She said, "Thank you, Papa." He picked up his tea, looked at it, put it back down. He said, "I will also say, since we are being plain, that I think you may have encountered someone who can see what I see, and if that turns out to be accurate, I will be very pleased, and if it turns out not to be, I will still be very pleased with you." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You are, in fact, the best of men." He said mildly that he was nothing of the sort, but that he appreciated the sentiment, and she smiled, and he smiled, and the room held them in its old, familiar warmth, and it was enough. He called on her. That was the fact that changed the texture of every conversation in Ashwick for the following week. He called on her, at the Bassett house, in the proper, formal way that meant something specific, and could not be reinterpreted as coincidence or social obligation. He came on a Friday afternoon, with his card, and with the calm directness of a man doing what he had decided to do, and he sat in the Bassett parlor for an hour, and drank tea, and spoke with Eleanor and her father, and when he left, he said he would like to call again, if that was welcome. Her father said that it was, and Eleanor said nothing, because she had become suddenly aware of a feeling in her chest that was larger than she had been prepared for, and she needed a moment to contain it before she was ready to use words. She stood at the parlor window, after he had gone, and watched the road, and felt the weight of the afternoon settling around her. She was not triumphant. She was not giddy. She was something quieter and more serious than either of those things, something closer to the feeling of standing at the edge of something large and real and understanding, for the first time, that you are actually going to step forward. Her mother appeared in the doorway. She said, "Eleanor," and then stopped, as if she had started the sentence without knowing how it ended. Eleanor turned from the window. Her mother said, after a moment, "He is very serious." Eleanor said, "Yes, he is." Her mother said, "He looks at you as if you are the most interesting thing in the room." Eleanor said, "I believe that may be why he is here." Her mother was quiet, and then she did something Eleanor had not expected. She sat down on the settee and put her hands in her lap and said, "I have not always seen you correctly. I want you to know that I know that." She said it plainly, without excessive ceremony, in the way that honest admissions sometimes come, not dramatically, but with a quiet weight that makes them more, rather than less significant. Eleanor sat down beside her. She said, "You have always loved me." Her mother said, "That is not the same thing." Eleanor said, "No, but it is something." Her mother nodded, and then she did not say anything else, and they sat together in the parlor, in the quiet that follows something true being said, the particular piece of a thing that has been carried for a long time, being finally set down. The second call came the following Tuesday, the third on Thursday. By the end of that week, there was no longer any ambiguity in Ashwick about what was happening, or at least about the appearance of what was happening, and the town had shifted its narrative accordingly. This did not mean the commentary stopped. The commentary never stops in a small town. But its character changed. The way the weather changes, and what had been expressed as incredulity, was now expressed in the more complex language of reluctant reassessment, the particular tone of people who had been proven premature in their conclusions, and were finding their way toward a new position, without quite wanting to admit the movement. Her Aunt Margaret, in a demonstration of character that Eleanor had not fully expected from her, came to Eleanor privately during her visit that week, and said, simply, that she had been wrong, and that she was sorry. She said it with the difficulty of a woman who did not find admissions easy, which made the saying of it harder and more valuable at once. Eleanor thanked her and meant it, and they did not revisit it, because some things are said once and then lived forward. What Eleanor was finding, in these days of calls and conversations, and the strange new experience of being openly sought, was that being wanted for the right reasons was an entirely different experience from what she had imagined being wanted might feel like. She had imagined, on the occasions when she had allowed herself to imagine it, that being chosen would feel like relief, the long exhale, after years of being passed over, and there was some of that. She would be dishonest if she pretended there was not. There was a real and genuine release in discovering that someone could meet her fully and find her, in her fullness, worth returning to. But mostly what she felt was not relief. Mostly what she felt was a kind of curious, expanding engagement, the feeling of a conversation that had not yet reached the interesting part, but that was clearly going somewhere she wanted to follow. She was learning him, in the incremental way you learn someone you are going to know for a long time, the specific way he paused before saying something he had thought carefully about, and the way he became slightly more animated when a subject interested him, which he tried not to show and which showed anyway. She learned that he had a brother he was fond of, and complicated about in equal measure. She learned that he read widely and slowly, which she found interesting, because she read widely and quickly, and they had already had 2 conversations about whether pace changed comprehension, that neither of them had finished. She learned that he had a sense of responsibility about his position that was not pomposity, but something genuinely considered, the weight of knowing that many people's lives and livelihoods were connected to his decisions, and taking that seriously rather than simply assuming the entitlement without the obligation. She told him things too. She told him about her father's study and the years she had spent reading there. She told him about Francis and about the print shop and about what it had meant to her to have one person in her life who spoke to her without managing the information. She told him about the market and the cheese seller and the woman with the dried flowers and the man with the parsnips. She told him about the notebook she kept and the kind of things she wrote in it, not the contents, those were hers, but the practice of it, the need she had to find words for things before she could be sure she understood them. He listened to all of this with genuine attention. He asked questions that showed he had understood what she said and wanted to understand more. He did not summarize her back to herself or redirect her observations toward something he found more comfortable. He simply listened, and in listening, he gave her the experience of being heard, which was something Eleanor had found rare enough in her life to understand its value precisely. On the fourth call, a Wednesday, he came in the late afternoon, and the light in the parlor was that particular gold that autumn afternoons produce, when the sun is low and the air is clear. They had been talking for about an hour, a conversation that had moved through several subjects with the easy, branching quality their conversations usually had, following interest rather than agenda. There was a pause, a comfortable one, the kind that happens between people who are at ease with each other. He said, into the pause, "I would like to speak with your father." Eleanor heard him. She was quiet for a moment, the way you are quiet when something large and real arrives. Then she said, "I see." He said, "Before I do, I would like to know what you think. Not in the general sense, specifically, what you think about the possibility I am alluding to." She looked at him. She said, "You are asking me, before asking my father." He said, "Yes. His permission matters. Your opinion matters more." This was such a straightforwardly stated reversal of the usual order of things, that Eleanor sat with it for a moment and felt something move through her that was warm and clear, and without any of the complicated weight she had carried through most of the preceding weeks. She said, "I think that it is not a possibility I have found myself opposed to." He said, "That is a very restrained way of putting it." She said, "I am a restrained person." He said, "You are also, when you choose to be, an extremely direct one." She said, then directly, "Yes, I think about the possibility you are alluding to, and I find that I want it. I have found that for some time. I was not going to say it first, because I did not think it was mine to say first, but yes." He looked at her, and the late afternoon gold came in through the window and lay across the floor between them, and he said, "Good, then I will speak with your father." He spoke with her father that same afternoon, before he left. Her father, she later learned, had listened with the close attention of a man who had already done considerable thinking on the subject and had reached a conclusion he was satisfied with, and when William had finished, her father had said that Eleanor was a woman of considerable understanding, and that whoever had the privilege of her full attention was fortunate and ought to know it. William had said that he did know it. Her father had said that in that case there was nothing more to discuss. Eleanor heard this account from her father that evening, who told it with the understated pleasure of a man whose confidence in his daughter had been confirmed by someone else's recognition of the same. She listened and felt the evening settle around her with a warmth and reality that was nothing like what she had imagined when she had imagined this moment in the past, if she had imagined it. It was simpler. It was more solid. It did not have the elevated quality of the stories she had read, the grand declarations and the sweeping moments. It was just real and close and hers, and that turned out to be better than the alternative. She went upstairs. Clara knocked on her door and came in without waiting for an answer, which was Clara's way, and said, "Is it true?" And Eleanor said it was, and Clara made a sound of such complete delight that Eleanor laughed, and Clara threw her arms around her sister, and they stood there in the small room for a moment, and Eleanor felt the genuine, uncomplicated happiness of her sister's happiness for her, which was a particular and irreplaceable kind of being loved. She sat at her window later, after the house had quieted. The night was clear and cold, and the stars were out in the full, crowded way they only appear on nights when the air is perfectly clean. She looked at them for a while. She thought about the girl she had been, the one who had stood at windows in smaller dresses waiting for the world to see her, the one who had been told she was too much of one thing and not enough of another, the one who had learned to want things quietly, privately, so that if they did not come, the wanting itself was not a public failure. She wanted to tell that girl something. She wanted to tell her that the quietness was not a concession, that being yourself, entirely yourself, even in a world that had decided you were not the right kind of self, was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the only thing. It was the thing that had made this possible, not by earning it, not by performing into acceptability, but by simply being present and real, until someone with the right kind of eyes came near enough to see clearly. She would not have known how to say that to the younger Eleanor. She was not sure the younger Eleanor would have believed her, but she knew it now, in the full way that some things can only be known from the other side of them. She knew it in her bones. She looked at the stars a little longer. Then she closed the curtain and went to bed. And for the first time in a long time, she slept immediately. The deep and dreamless sleep of someone who has arrived somewhere they belong. The engagement became known, as engagements in a town like Ashwick always do, before any formal announcement had been made. This was not a failure of discretion on anyone's part. It was simply the nature of a place where human connection had been the primary source of information for several generations, and the infrastructure for it was extremely well developed. By Saturday morning, 2 days after William had spoken with her father, there were people in the market who already knew, and some who had known since Thursday afternoon, and others who heard it from Eleanor's face before she had said a word, because there was something different about her, in a way that was visible to anyone who had known her long enough to read the difference. Eleanor noticed the change in how people approached her. Some came with genuine warmth, the particular warmth of people who had quietly liked her all along, and were now free to show it more openly, because the social calculation had shifted. The cheese seller grabbed her hand and said she was a fine young woman, and he had always thought so. The woman with the dried flowers gave her a small bunch without charge. These things touched Eleanor in the soft, private way that unexpected kindnesses do, the ones that find you when you have already decided you did not need them. Others came, with the careful warmth of people adjusting their position. They were pleasant. They were slightly more interested in her than they had been before. They said the right things. Eleanor received them without judgment, because she understood that people are shaped by the world they live in, and that the world they lived in had constructed a very clear set of signals about who was worth knowing, and those signals had now changed in her case. And it was the signals that had changed, not the people, not really, not underneath. She was the same person she had been 2 weeks ago. She had always been worth knowing. This was not a new fact. It was a newly visible one. Frances came on Saturday afternoon and brought cake, which she said was not a celebration cake, but was in fact just a cake she had made, because she had wanted cake. And Eleanor said this was the correct approach, and they ate the cake at the kitchen table and talked for a long time. Frances said, at some point in the middle of the afternoon, that she had been thinking about Eleanor for a long time, in the way that you think about someone who you can see is remarkable, and are waiting for the world to catch up to what you already know. She said she had not always been patient about the waiting, but she had always believed the catch-up would come. Eleanor said, and now it has come in the form of a duke, which is frankly a more dramatic version than I would have predicted. Frances said, well, you were never a small kind of person. It was always going to be something commensurate. Eleanor thought about this. She said, I think the important part is not what he is. I think the important part is who he is. Frances said, those are not always the same thing. Eleanor said, no, but in this case they happen to line up, which I accept as a form of luck. Frances said, I think it is less luck than you are giving it credit for. You met him being exactly yourself. The rest followed from that. Eleanor said she supposed that was true. Frances said, it is absolutely true. And the thing I want you to remember, when this all becomes large and people begin to tell the story of it, is that the reason it happened is not because you were fortunate enough to be seen. It is because you were brave enough to be visible. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, that is perhaps the finest thing anyone has said to me. Frances said it was accurate rather than fine, and poured more tea, and they sat with the afternoon light moving across the kitchen table. And the cake was excellent, and the world outside continued doing what it always did, which was going on, and Eleanor was in it, fully in it, and she was glad. The days after that had a particular quality Eleanor had not experienced before. She was engaged. She was known to be engaged. She was the person this had happened to, which was a thing she turned over several times a day, not in disbelief, because she had made her peace with believing it, but in the quiet way you look at something real and new, from different angles, to understand all the ways it is true. She and William continued to see each other, with the proper frequency their situation called for, and also with the particular quality of two people who had moved past the establishing phase of knowing each other, and were now in the deeper, more detailed phase. The phase where you discover not only what someone thinks but how they think, not only what they value but how they act, in the absence of anyone watching. She discovered, in this phase, that he was capable of being wrong, and saying so without excessive drama, which she considered essential. She discovered that he had a genuine affection for his estate's people, Not the sentimental affection of someone who had romanticized the relationship between a landowner and his tenants, but the practical, attentive affection of someone who understood that the lives connected to his decisions were real and complicated and deserving of care. She discovered that he was funny in the way clever people are funny, quietly and precisely, and without needing a response that acknowledged the humor, though he clearly appreciated it when the response came. She also discovered, in a conversation on a cold afternoon in the Bassett parlor, that he had known what people were saying about her, not in the vague way of someone who had been told later, but in the immediate way, from early in their acquaintance. He had heard the commentary. He had understood its nature, and he had made his choices in full possession of that information, which meant that what he had chosen was not simply her, but her in the face of an environment that had decided against her, and he had found the environment mistaken, and he had acted accordingly. She said, when he told her this, "And you were not deterred." He said, "No, I found it informative." She said, "What did it inform you of?" He said, "That the people making the commentary were using the wrong measure." Which told me something about their judgment that was useful to know. She looked at him. She said, "You are, in fact, a person of considerable good sense." He said that he hoped so, as he had been trying for 31 years. She laughed, and he smiled, and the fire in the parlor burned, and the winter afternoon pressed against the windows, and inside the room there was warmth of the kind that is made not by a fireplace, but by two people who have found each other genuinely, without performance and without pretense, and who have decided to remain. The letter arrived from Aldenmere on a Monday, forwarded to William at Lord Ashby's house, and he told Eleanor about its contents on his next visit, which was the following Wednesday. He told her simply and directly, in the way he told her everything, without adjusting the information to soften it or restructure it to manage her response. The letter was from his mother, Lady Cavendish. She had heard, through the channels that news travels when the person at the center of it is a man of his position, that he had formed an attachment in the county and was conducting the preliminary stages of what appeared to be a serious intention. She wrote that she was interested to meet the young woman in question. She wrote that she hoped the young woman in question was appropriate to the responsibilities of the position. She wrote these two sentences in a way that made very clear they were the same sentence arranged differently, because appropriate, in her lexicon, meant fitted, and fitted meant certain specific things that Lady Cavendish had developed clear views about over the course of a long and carefully observed social life. Eleanor heard all of this. She asked William, when he had finished, whether his mother was a woman of strong opinion. He said, with characteristic precision, "She is a woman of deeply held conviction," which is not the same thing, because conviction implies a process of arriving at the position, whereas opinion can simply be received. Her convictions have, on most subjects, the quality of things she has thought about very carefully. On the subject of who is fitted to occupy the role of Duchess of Aldenmere, she has not, to my knowledge, done very much thinking, because she has operated on assumptions that have never been sufficiently challenged. Eleanor said, "And you believe meeting me will challenge them?" He said, "I believe meeting you will give them the opportunity to be revised. Whether they are revised will depend on her." Eleanor appreciated the honesty of this. She said, "And if they are not?" He looked at her directly. He said, "Then she will be wrong, and I will have made that clear, and we will proceed." Eleanor said, "You are very certain." He said, "I have had some weeks to become certain. That is what the preceding weeks have been for, at least in part." She thought about this. She said, "When?" He said Lady Cavendish was traveling south within the month and would pass near the region. She would come to Lord Ashby's house for several days. He would arrange a meeting, a proper one, a dinner, with the full social weight of a formal introduction, because anything less formal would give his mother grounds to say the introduction had been insufficient and that she had not properly met the person in question. He was not going to give her that ground. Eleanor nodded. She said, "Very well." He said, "Are you afraid?" She considered the question, genuinely, rather than giving the quick, reassuring answer. She said, "Not of her. I am aware that I ought to be, by the social conventions we are operating in. A woman of her standing assessing me for adequacy, this should be frightening. But I find that what I feel is more like steadiness. I have spent 23 years being assessed for adequacy by people who were using the wrong measure. I have some practice with it." He said, "I had thought you might say something like that." She said, "And you find it reassuring?" He said, "I find it accurate," which is more useful than reassuring. The following weeks were full, in the way that weeks become when something large is approaching. Eleanor spent a morning with her mother, who had taken a deep breath and committed herself, with admirable resolution, to the position that her daughter was going to meet Lady Cavendish as herself, and that this was the correct approach, even though Eleanor could see the cost of this commitment in her mother's face, which still occasionally flickered with the old worry, the deep-trained anxiety about what the powerful thought of what they saw. Eleanor honored both the commitment and the cost of it, because she understood her mother better now than she ever had. She had a long conversation with Frances, not about strategy. Frances was philosophically opposed to social strategy, but about Eleanor's own state of mind, because Frances wanted to know what was actually happening inside her friend, and was not satisfied with the version of Eleanor that said everything was fine. Eleanor, after a moment of the usual resistance, told her honestly. She said she was steadier than she had expected to be. She said there was a layer of her that was aware of the stakes, aware that Lady Cavendish held a kind of social authority that was real, even if Eleanor did not fully accept its right to be decisive. She said she was not performing fearlessness. She was genuinely less afraid than she should have been, and she thought the reason for that was that she had already spent so long living inside the outcome people had confidently predicted for her, the overlooked, insufficient outcome, and she had lived inside it without collapsing, and she knew now that she could survive whatever Lady Cavendish decided. What she would not survive without damage was abandoning herself in order to become something Lady Cavendish preferred. Frances said, "You will not do that." Eleanor said, "No, I will not." Frances said, "Then you are going to be fine." Eleanor said she hoped so. Frances said, hope had nothing to do with it. The day of the dinner arrived with a particular quality of coolness, the air clear and sharp, the sky the pale, definite blue of deep winter. Lord Ashby's house was warm inside, as it always was, with fires in every public room and the particular smell of the season, wood smoke and the dried flowers that Mrs. Ashby arranged with seasonal precision. Eleanor arrived with William, who had collected her in his own carriage, and this detail alone, the visible, public collection from her family home, carried a message that she knew he had intended it to carry, because he was not a man who missed such things. Lady Cavendish was already in the sitting room when they arrived. She was a woman of perhaps 60, with a bearing that came from so many years of inhabiting a certain kind of authority that it had become simply the way she occupied space, very straight, very measured, with eyes that moved quickly and settled completely. She was dressed with the understated precision of someone who had enough confidence in their position not to require demonstration. She looked at Eleanor with a directness that was almost refreshing in its honesty, the direct look of a woman who had decided not to be subtle about the assessment she was conducting. Eleanor looked back. She did not look away. She was not aggressive in her not looking away. She was simply present, in her own way, the way she was always present, with full attention and without apology. Lady Cavendish said, "Miss Bassett." Eleanor said, "Lady Cavendish." There was a pause of about 3 seconds, which is longer than it sounds when two people are looking at each other directly. Then Lady Cavendish said, "William tells me you are a woman of considerable intelligence." Eleanor said, "William is a perceptive judge of these things." Lady Cavendish's expression shifted fractionally. Eleanor watched it shift, and was not sure yet what it had shifted toward. They went in to dinner. There were 6 at the table, Lord and Mrs. Ashby, who hosted with their characteristic ease, William, Lady Cavendish, Eleanor, and a cousin of Lord Ashby's who was visiting, and who turned out to be excellent company, and wholly unaware of the dynamic operating at the other end of the table, which was perhaps fortunate. Eleanor was herself at dinner. She was engaged in the conversation, genuinely engaged, not performing engagement. She disagreed with Lord Ashby on one point about local policy, and said so with the polite precision she applied to disagreement, not aggressively, but without retreat. She asked Lady Cavendish, at a certain point, about Aldenmere, because she was genuinely curious about the estate and about the history of the region, and Lady Cavendish, who loved Aldenmere with the fierce, particular love of someone who had been connected to a place for decades, answered with unexpected depth and animation. This turned out to be the moment. Not a dramatic moment, not one that announced itself. Eleanor asked a follow-up question that showed she had been listening, and had understood the history Lady Cavendish had described, in the way that you only understand something if you have been actually paying attention. And Lady Cavendish looked at her, mid-sentence, with a new quality in her expression, something that had not been there at the beginning of the dinner. Something that was, if not exactly warmth, at least recognition. After dinner, the women withdrew while the men finished their wine, and Eleanor and Mrs. Ashby and Lady Cavendish sat in the small, warm parlor off the dining room, and Mrs. Ashby, with excellent social instinct, asked Lady Cavendish about the North, and Lady Cavendish talked for a while about the region, and then there was a natural pause in the conversation, and Lady Cavendish looked at Eleanor and said, without prelude, "You are not what I expected." Eleanor said, "What did you expect?" Lady Cavendish said, "Something more eager to please." Eleanor said, "I am not sure eagerness to please is a quality that serves anyone well in the long term, including the person being pleased." Lady Cavendish looked at her for a moment that stretched just long enough to carry weight. Then she said, "No, I suppose it is not." They sat. The fire went on being warm. Mrs. Ashby made a discreet comment about the quality of the wine from dinner, and the conversation moved on, and what had just happened was not referenced again that evening. When William walked Eleanor to her carriage at the end of the evening, he said, "Well." She said, "We will see." He said, "I thought it went well." She said, "I think it went honestly, which is the best I could have done." He said that honest and well were the same thing in his experience, at least for the people worth persuading. She said she hoped his experience was correct. He said, "My mother is not an easy woman, but she is not a foolish one. She will have seen what there is to see." Eleanor thought about the moment at the dinner table, the shift in Lady Cavendish's expression when she had asked the follow-up question about Aldenmere. She thought about the moment in the parlor, the "not what I expected," and the way the conversation had moved on after it, not with coldness or dismissal, but with the particular quality of a conversation that has shifted its ground and is now operating on new terrain. She said, "I think she may have seen enough." He said, "I think so too." She got into the carriage. The night was cold and clear, and the stars were the same stars that had been there every night, reliable and indifferent and beautiful. She looked at them through the carriage window as they moved through the dark, and she thought about what it meant to be seen, not by a town, not by a social world, not by the collective judgment of people who measured you against a template you had never agreed to be seen by the people who mattered, the specific, individual people whose seeing meant something, the person who had chosen to know her and was going on knowing her, and the woman who had come prepared to find her insufficient, and had found, instead, something she had not expected to find. She held the evening in her chest as the carriage moved through the dark. She did not call it a triumph because she did not yet know what it was. She did not call it a guarantee because she was too honest for that. She called it what it was, which was a good evening, and a real one, and hers. And that was enough. Lady Cavendish stayed at Lord Ashby's house for 4 days. In those 4 days, she and Eleanor met twice more, once at an afternoon tea that Lord Ashby organized, and once when William brought Eleanor to the house for what he described as an informal visit, which was somewhat more structured than informal implied, but less formal than dinner. Each meeting had its own particular quality. At the afternoon tea, Lady Cavendish observed more than she spoke, watching Eleanor, in the broader company of a larger gathering, with the patient attention of a woman taking additional evidence. At the informal visit, she asked Eleanor direct questions about her upbringing, her education, and her understanding of what a life at Aldenmere would require. Eleanor answered these questions directly, not with the inflated confidence of someone performing a version of themselves, but with the honest, measured directness that was her natural mode. She told Lady Cavendish that she knew her background was not what was expected. She said it plainly, without apology, and without the particular kind of defensive explanation that implies you believe you owe someone a defense. She said that she had grown up in a household where she had been given access to ideas, and to work, and to the responsibility of actual thought, and that she believed this had prepared her well for the demands of a serious life, even if it had not prepared her in the specific social graces that the expected preparation would have emphasized. She said she was willing to learn what she did not yet know. She said she was not willing to pretend to be someone she was not, because she had tried versions of that throughout her life, and found it both exhausting and ineffective. Lady Cavendish heard all of this. She said, when Eleanor had finished, that she had one more question. She asked Eleanor whether she loved her son. Eleanor did not hesitate. She said yes. She said it with the simplicity of a statement that is true, rather than performed. And she met Lady Cavendish's eyes when she said it, and Lady Cavendish held the eye contact for a moment, and then looked down at her hands. She said, "He is not always easy." Eleanor said, "I know that. The things worth committing to rarely are." Lady Cavendish looked up. She said, "You are not what I expected." Eleanor said, "You said that at dinner." Lady Cavendish said, "I am saying it again." Eleanor said nothing. She let the repetition stand. Lady Cavendish said, after a pause, "I hope you will be good for him. He has needed, for some time, the kind of person who does not manage him." Eleanor said, "I have no interest in managing him. I have a great deal of interest in being honest with him." Lady Cavendish said that this was, in her experience, more valuable. They sat for a moment in something that was not yet warmth but was in the family of warmth, the early, cautious relative of it. Then Mrs. Ashby brought more tea, and the conversation changed direction, and they went on with the afternoon. And Eleanor felt, somewhere below the careful steadiness she had been maintaining, the slow loosening of something that had been held very tight for a very long time. She told William about it afterward, not dramatically, just the facts of what was said and the quality of it. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he said his mother had spoken to him as well, briefly, that morning. She had said that Eleanor was clearly not conventional. He said he had told his mother he was aware of this, and that it was why he had made his choice. His mother had been quiet for a moment, and then she had said, and this was the thing William told Eleanor with the quality of someone reporting something that had mattered to them. She had said that unconventional was not the same as unsuitable, and that she thought she had been using the words interchangeably for too long. Eleanor heard this. She felt it land. She said, "That is a remarkable thing for her to say." He said, "She is a remarkable woman, when she allows herself to be." Eleanor said, "I think she is going to be all right." He said, "I think so too." They walked in the garden after this, despite the cold, because they both preferred being outside to being inside when the conversation had been substantial, and the air was clean, and the light was already failing in the blue-gray way of winter afternoons. She tucked her hand through his arm, and they walked along the path that ran beside the house's kitchen garden, bare and formal-looking in the winter, and they talked about small things, the kind of small things that are only possible between people who have already talked about the large things, and have enough room now for the ordinary. He said, at one point, that he had been thinking about Aldenmuir, and about what she would think of it, and whether she wanted, in the spring, to visit it before they were married. She said she very much wanted that. He said he thought she would have opinions about the library, because it was very good but poorly organized, and he had been meaning to reorganize it for 3 years and had not, because the project required someone with strong views and enough patience for the scale of it. Eleanor said that this described her precisely, and that she would be glad to bring both qualities to bear. He said he had thought as much. They walked until the light was fully gone, and the cold had become too substantial to ignore, and then they went back inside, and there was tea, and there was the warm, ordinary life of an evening, and Lady Cavendish was at the far end of the room, with Lord Ashby's cousin, deep in a conversation about horses, which was apparently a subject on which she held very strong and precisely detailed views, and she did not look up when Eleanor came in, or perhaps she did, briefly, just briefly, and then she returned to her conversation. But the look, if it had happened, was a different look from the one at the beginning of the dinner on the first night. It did not have the same quality of assessment. It had something else in it, something that was still finding its shape, still deciding what it was, but that was oriented, at least, in a direction that was not opposition. Eleanor accepted this. She did not need more than this, not yet. Progress toward something was not the same as arrival, but it was real, and it was enough to work with, and she had learned, over a lifetime of being patient with a world that was slow to see her, that enough to work with was a good place to begin. The formal announcement appeared in print on a Friday in late November, and by Friday evening, there was not a person in Ashwick who had not heard it, and by Saturday morning, the conversation had spread beyond Ashwick, in the way that certain pieces of news spread, carried by the natural networks of a connected countryside, passed from household to household, with the speed and energy of something that people found worth repeating. Eleanor Bassett, of Ashwick, daughter of George Bassett, account keeper, was to marry William Cavendish, Duke of Aldenmere. Eleanor read the announcement in the printed sheet her father had obtained from the town printer, and held it for a moment, just held it, the thin paper with its ink and its factual sentences, and she felt the weight of it as a real thing, which was different from the weight of it as an idea. The idea had been building for weeks, accumulating reality at each stage, the calls, the engagement, the meeting with Lady Cavendish. But the printed sentence had a specific quality, a thisness, that was its own kind of arrival. She set it down and went to the window, and the town was going about its Saturday with the usual industry of a market day, people moving with purpose and noise along the main street, the sounds of the world doing what it always did, and she was in it, still herself, still here, and also, now, something more than she had been when the morning had started, not more in the way of value, she had always had that, but more in the way of visibility, the kind of visibility that the world had decided, on its own schedule, and in its own time, to finally extend. The responses came throughout the day. Her mother's friends came in a steady stream to the house to offer congratulations, some of them the same women who had, in the same parlor, in the preceding weeks, made comments that had found their way back to Eleanor. They came now with the particular combination of genuine pleasure and recalibrated position that people adopt when the world has made their previous certainties obsolete. Eleanor received them all with the warmth that was her natural way with people, without triumphalism and without the temptation to reference what had been said before, because she understood that the graceful response to being vindicated was the same as the graceful response to everything else, which was to be exactly yourself and let the moment speak for itself. Aunt Margaret stayed 3 extra days, which she had not originally planned to do, and spent most of those days in a state of productive domestic activity that Eleanor recognized as her aunt's way of processing emotion. She pressed things and cleaned things and organized the kitchen and made remarks about the preparations that would need to begin, all with the energy of a woman who needed to be moving. Eleanor did not resist any of it. She let her aunt move through the house, and she stepped around her when necessary, and she answered the questions that needed answering, and she allowed her aunt to be part of the preparation, because that was her aunt's way of saying something she could not say directly, and Eleanor had always been good at hearing what people meant, rather than only what they said. What she heard, underneath her aunt's activity, was something like, "I was wrong about you. I am sorry for the ways in which my wrong assessment may have diminished you. I love you, and I am going to do something useful now." Eleanor accepted all of this, in the form it was given, which was not the direct verbal form, but the only form her aunt could manage, and she was glad of it, because it was real, and it was enough. Frances came on Saturday evening, after the stream of visitors had slowed, and they sat in the kitchen as they always did, and Frances said very little for a while, which was unusual, and Eleanor waited, because Frances's silences always had something coming after them. Then Frances said, "Are you happy?" Eleanor thought about the question seriously, which it deserved. She said, "Yes," not in the simple, bright way, in the deep, solid way, the kind that feels like something you can build on. Frances said, "That is the better kind." Eleanor said, "I think so too." Frances said, "Then I am completely glad." She said it simply, without performance, and Eleanor believed her entirely, which was the thing about Frances. You always believed her entirely, because she never said things she did not mean. They sat and talked for a long time that evening, ranging across the past and the present and the future, in the way that conversations do when you are comfortable enough to go anywhere. They talked about Frances's life and what she wanted from it, because it was important to Eleanor that the evening not be only about Eleanor. And Frances talked about the print shop and her growing interest in actually composing text, rather than only setting type, and the possibility that her father might allow her to write something for a local publication he was beginning. Eleanor listened to this with the full attention she reserved for things that mattered, and she said that she thought Frances should write everything she had to say, and that she thought there was a great deal worth reading that was currently inside her friend's head, and Frances said Eleanor was biased, and Eleanor said yes but also correct, and Frances laughed and agreed. In the weeks that followed the announcement, Eleanor began the process of understanding what her future life would actually contain. This was a practical process, as much as an emotional one, and she approached it the way she approached most things, with careful attention and a preference for direct information over assumption. She asked William questions, the real questions, The ones about how a large estate was managed, and what her specific role would be, and what Lady Cavendish's involvement in the running of Aldenmere had historically looked like, and whether the expectations of her, practically speaking, were articulated somewhere, or whether she was expected to determine them as she went. He answered all of these questions with the thoroughness they deserved, because he had long since understood that Eleanor's questions were always worth answering properly. The picture that emerged was large and complex and real. Aldenmere was not simply a house. It was a community, with tenants and workers and dependencies and needs, and a history that went back more than 2 centuries. Managing it was not a single job, but many jobs, some of them formal, and some of them the kind that involved simply being present and available and paying attention. Lady Cavendish had managed it, in practice, for 30 years, and she had done so with capability and commitment, and now she was getting older and looking for someone to carry it forward. Eleanor heard all of this and understood, with the precision that came from actually thinking about what you were being told, that this was not simply a question of whether she wanted to marry William, though she did, entirely. It was a question of whether she wanted to take on a life that was genuinely demanding, in ways that would require things of her she had not previously been required to give. It was a question of whether she was willing to learn, quickly and seriously, things she did not yet know. It was a question of whether the version of herself she had been building for 23 years was up to the challenge of a life significantly larger than the one she had been living. She sat with these questions, not for long, but long enough to be honest with herself, and she found that what she felt, underneath everything, was not fear of the size of it. She felt something closer to recognition. She had spent her life in a context too small for her. She had been told, in every way available to the social world she inhabited, that she was too much of the wrong things, that her ideas ran beyond their proper scope, that her capability exceeded its appropriate application. She had been constrained, always, not by her own limitations but by the world's inability to see the full dimension of what she was. Aldenmere, with all its demands and all its complexity, and all the things she would need to learn and carry and manage and be, was not too large for her. It was, she thought, with something that felt like the deep, genuine pleasure of finally fitting, approximately the right size. She told William this, in those words, and he looked at her with an expression she had come to know well by now, the expression of someone whose conviction has been confirmed, in a way that makes it feel less like certainty and more like relief, the particular relief of having been right about something that mattered. He said, "I knew that, before you said it." She said, "I know, but I needed to say it myself." He said that was a very Eleanor answer. She said she was a very Eleanor person. The wedding date was set for the following April, when Aldenmere would be showing the first signs of the spring that Eleanor would, for the first time, be present to welcome. Between the announcement and the date, there was the full machinery of preparation, the dressmakers, and the letters, and the formal introductions to the extended circle of people connected to William's family and position. There were mornings when Eleanor's house was full of women with tape measures and opinions, and afternoons when she sat at her father's desk writing responses to correspondence that had arrived from people she had never met, but who were going to be part of her life. There were evenings when she felt the scale of the change ahead and had to breathe into it deliberately, not with fear, but with the care of someone acknowledging a large truth. She went on seeing Francis. She went on walking by the river. She went on reading in her father's study in the evenings, though the books were different now, more focused, because she had things to learn, and she was going to learn them. She went on being herself, through all of it, which was the only approach she had ever had, and the only one she intended to continue with. Her mother came to her one evening and said, with the difficulty of someone saying something they had been composing for some time, that she was proud of her. Not proud in the way of someone who is proud because something has worked out, but proud in the way of someone who has seen something clearly, perhaps for the first time. She said that Eleanor had always been remarkable, and that she had not always known how to say so, and that she was sorry for the times when the not saying had felt like not knowing, because she had known. She had always known. She had just not known how to put it into the world. Eleanor held her mother for a long moment. She said, "I know, Mama." She said it simply, and she meant it, and her mother held on a little longer than usual, and then they separated, and her mother wiped her eyes with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided that was quite enough of that, and went back to the kitchen to do something practical, which was her way of recovering her balance. and Eleanor stood in the hallway and looked at the stairs, and felt the whole weight of her life. The ordinary years, and the long patience, and the mornings she had made her own tea, and told herself quietly that she was going to that ball, and she was going as herself, and here she was, on the other side of all of it, still herself, more herself than she had ever been allowed to be, and about to become more. She went upstairs. She sat at her window. The town of Ashwick moved in the evening outside, ordinary and unchanged. The same streets, and the same sounds it had always had. And she sat inside it, and thought that she would miss it. This specific smallness. The cheese cellar, and the dried flowers, and the man with the parsnips. The way the river sounded in autumn. The light in her father's study on winter mornings. She would carry it with her. It was part of what she was, and what she was, all of it, was exactly what she was taking into the next part of her life. She wrote in her notebook. She wrote for a long time, not about the wedding or the estate or the future, but about herself, about who she was, and how she had become it, and what she understood now that she had not understood before. She wrote about the night before the ball, sitting at this same window, making the small private decision to go as herself. She wrote that she had not known then that the decision would matter in the way it turned out to matter. She wrote that she thought this was probably always how it worked. The important decisions happen quietly, without announcement, and their significance is only visible from the other side. She closed the notebook and set it on the windowsill. The night was still, and cold and clear. In 3 months, she would be married. In 3 months, she would travel north to a house she had not yet seen, to a life she was only beginning to understand, to a man she now knew without reservation, genuinely in love with, in the specific, particular way. That is not a feeling, so much as a recognition. That is the person I want to know for the rest of my life, in all the ordinary and extraordinary ways that knowing someone for a long time unfolds. She sat in the stillness of the room, and she let herself be glad, without qualification, without the old habit of trimming her own gladness back to a manageable size. She let it be the size it actually was. It was large, it was real, it was entirely hers. And it had started, all of it, from the simplest thing in the world. Being, in a room full of people, who were all trying to be something else, exactly herself. There was a morning, in December, when the snow came early, and without warning, covering the town in the particular hush that only snow produces, the way it absorbs sound and softens edges, and makes the familiar world look like a version of itself that has been cleaned and simplified. Eleanor woke to it, that muffled, white quality of the light coming through the curtain, and she lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet. Her wedding was 3 months away. Her life was going to change in ways she could not yet fully map. Lady Cavendish had written her a letter, which had arrived the previous week, carefully composed in the formal language of a woman making an effort across a genuine distance. It was not a warm letter, in the way that warmth is easy to perform. It was warm in the harder way, the way of someone who has adjusted a long-held position and is communicating the adjustment in the only language she has available, which is still formal, but is leaning, however slightly, towards something different. Eleanor had read it 3 times, and then put it in the notebook, between 2 pages, because it was the kind of thing worth preserving. She got up and looked out the window at the snow-covered street. The usual sounds were muffled, the market day beginning softly rather than briskly, the voices carrying across distance in the clean air. She watched a child run out of a house at the far end of the road and stand in the middle of the white street with their arms out, turning slowly, looking up at the sky. She watched this for a moment, the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child in new snow, and she felt it move through her as a simple, clean happiness. She thought about what it meant to have gotten here, not the destination, which was still ahead of her and was going to take years to fully understand. But here, this moment, this window, this particular December morning, she thought about all the mornings she had sat at windows in this house and looked out at this town and wondered whether the world was ever going to see what she was. She thought about how the wondering had been real, and the not knowing had been real, and the quiet holding on had been real. All those years of being herself, in a world that had decided it was not quite the right self. She thought, it was worth it. The holding on was worth it, not because it had led to this, not because the outcome justified the patience, but because the holding on itself had been the right thing. Being yourself, when the world has decided you are the wrong shape for the life you want, is not a strategy. It is not a plan, It is simply the only honest thing available to you, and honest things, though they do not always produce immediate results, do not accumulate regret. She had no regret. She had not managed herself into this life. She had not performed her way into it. She had simply arrived, as herself, with her full, complicated, specific, unreduced self. And she had been met by someone who could see all of it, and found it, in its fullness, worth choosing. The child in the street had stopped turning, and was now lying flat in the snow, making the shape that children make in snow, arms moving wide and slow. Eleanor watched until the shape was complete, and then the child got up and looked at their impression in the white ground, and the satisfaction on their face was visible even from this distance. She turned from the window. There were things to do today, letters to write, and fittings to attend, and a visit from her mother's old friend, who had come all the way from 2 towns away to offer congratulations in person. She was going to do all of these things, and she was going to do them as herself, which was the only way she knew how to do anything, and it was, she now understood in the full and settled way that she had come to understand most things, completely, and more than enough. She dressed and went downstairs. The house smelled of bread and wood smoke and morning, and her father was already in his chair with his book, and he said good morning without looking up, and she said good morning back, and went to make tea for both of them, and the ordinary, irreplaceable life of the house went on around her, and she was in it, fully in it, and she was home. The journey north to Aldenmere took 2 days, and Eleanor spent most of them looking out of the carriage window at a landscape that grew larger and wilder as they traveled, the hills becoming hills rather than gentle rises, the sky getting wider, the trees more spare and determined. She had married William on a Thursday in April, at the church in Ashwick, in a ceremony that her father had organized with quiet dignity, and her mother had spent 3 weeks preparing for, with the focused energy of someone who needed to be doing something, and had finally been given something worthy of doing. Frances had been there, standing where Eleanor could see her, with the expression she wore when she was moved and was not going to show it, which was to say, with a very level face that had something complicated happening behind it. The church had been full. People who had not previously sought Eleanor's company had been very interested in being present at the occasion of her becoming a duchess. Eleanor had noticed this without particular feeling, not bitterness and not satisfaction. These things happened. The world recalibrated. The people in it moved according to the calibration. She bore no one ill will for it. She was simply at the front of the church, in a dress that was the color of cream, and that her mother had overseen with such devotion that it was as close to perfect as the making of a dress could achieve. And William was beside her, and the words were said, and she meant every one of them. What she remembered most from the wedding day, afterward, was not the ceremony itself, or the celebrations afterward, at her parents' house, where every neighbor in Ashwick had come, or the moment when William's hand had found hers, as they walked out of the church into the April sunlight. What she remembered was the moment the previous evening, sitting in her room for the last time, as the person she had been, with the small leather notebook open in her lap, writing. She had written until she ran out of things to write, which had taken some time, and then she had sat in the quiet, and she had said goodbye to the version of herself that would exist only until tomorrow. The unmarried Eleanor Bassett of Ashwick, the woman who had sat at so many windows, and she had done this without grief, with something closer to gratitude, because that woman, that patient, quiet, unperforming, entirely herself woman, had done everything right, and now she was going to carry her forward into the next chapter. She arrived at Aldenmere in the late afternoon of the second day, when the light was golden and horizontal, and landing across everything with the particular precision of late day in spring. The house emerged from the surrounding landscape in a way that was nothing like Lord Ashby's house, nothing like any house Eleanor had seen. It was very old, and it had the quality of things that have grown into their landscape over centuries, the stone the color of the earth around it, the proportions that made you feel it had always been there, not built, but placed. There were trees everywhere, old trees, with roots that went deep enough to make them as permanent as the hills. The gardens were beginning, the spring just starting to assert itself, crocuses along the path and something else Eleanor could not yet name climbing the south wall. She got out of the carriage, and she stood on the gravel of the drive, and she looked at it. William stood beside her and let her look. He did not explain or describe or prepare her. He simply stood there and let her take it in, because he had understood, by now, that this was how Eleanor received important things. She said, after a while, "It is exactly the right size," he said. "That is what I hoped you would say." They went in. The household was assembled to meet her, which was a formal tradition, of the kind that Eleanor had been told to expect, but which was still, in its actuality, a different experience from the expectation. There were about 20 people standing in the entrance hall, the housekeeper and the steward and the cook and the senior members of the household staff, all of them looking at her with the particular quality of attention that people bring to someone new who is going to have authority over their lives. She understood what was being assessed, not her appearance, not the shape of her, but whether she was the kind of person who would be fair and reasonable and genuinely present, or the kind who would occupy the title without occupying the role. She met every one of them. She asked each person their name and their position, and she stored this information with the precision her memory allowed, which was considerable, and she said something specific to each person, not a formula, but something that showed she had actually heard what they had said. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Dalloway, with 30 years in the house, watched her do this with an expression that began as measured and moved, by the end of the introductions, toward something more like approval, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but is visible to someone paying attention. The first weeks at Aldenmere were an education in the most complete sense Eleanor had ever experienced, which was saying something considerable, given how much she had read and thought and applied herself over 23 years. She learned by asking, and by observing, and by doing, and by making mistakes, and acknowledging them without excessive self-punishment, and by asking again. She learned the geography of the estate in the most physical way, walking it, in good weather and in rain, with William, or with the steward, or alone, because she needed to understand the land with her own feet, in a way that a map could not give her. She learned the names of the tenants and their specific circumstances, and she made herself available in the way that she had seen Lady Cavendish operate in the brief time she had known her, which was not grandly, but practically, present and accountable. Lady Cavendish had returned to the house for the first month after the wedding, which had been arranged with care on both their parts. She had been there to provide information and guidance, and the accumulated knowledge of 30 years, and she had given it with a generosity that Eleanor had not taken for granted, and would not forget. There had been moments between them that were difficult, because they were two strong-minded women with different orientations to the same life, and the navigation of those moments required patience on both sides. But there were also moments that were genuinely good, when they were working through a problem together, or sitting in the evening over the estate accounts, and Lady Cavendish was explaining something, and Eleanor was following with the close attention that Lady Cavendish had, Eleanor thought, been hungry for without knowing it, someone who could actually keep up, someone for whom the detail was not tedious but interesting. Lady Cavendish left in May, and the house, on the day she departed, felt both different and the same, the way a house does when the person who has shaped it for a long time is no longer in it. Eleanor stood at the window and watched the carriage go, and felt the weight of what she had just taken on, the full, specific, unglamorous weight of it, and she breathed into it, and then went back to the desk, and continued what she had been working on, because that was the only approach that made sense, to keep working, to keep learning, to keep being present. William came to find her an hour later, and she looked up and he said, "How are you?" She said, "I am fine. I am also slightly terrified." He said, "Good. Slightly terrified is the appropriate response. It means you understand the reality of the situation." She said, "And people who are not slightly terrified," he said, "have either misunderstood the situation or have a quality of confidence that I find more alarming than slightly terrified." She laughed, and he sat down in the chair across from her desk, and they talked through the things she was working on, and it was practical and specific and real, and she felt, as she always felt in these conversations, the particular pleasure of being taken seriously by someone who was in the same work as she was, not above her and not below her, but alongside her, which was, she thought, the only kind of partnership worth having. The summer came to Aldenmere with a fullness that took Eleanor by surprise. She had not known that the countryside in the north could be this particular kind of beautiful, the way the hills held the light in the long evenings, and the fields had a quality of abundance that felt personal, as if the land were doing something generous for the people on it. She walked every morning before breakfast, a habit she had brought from Ashwick, and that the estate provided better landscape for than she had hoped. She learned the paths, which ones were solid, and which turned to mud after rain, which one led to the view over the valley that she returned to repeatedly, because it was the kind of view that answered something in her. She wrote to Francis every week. Francis wrote back with news of the print shop and of Ashwick, and with observations about the world that were as sharp and clear as she had always been. In one letter, Francis mentioned that she had begun writing a regular column for the local publication her father had started, a column about matters of general interest in the community, and that it was being received well enough that the editor, who was Francis's father, had asked her to make it a regular feature. Eleanor read this, and felt a gladness for Francis that was as genuine as anything she felt, and she wrote back immediately, saying she had known this would happen, and that she was looking forward to reading everything Francis ever wrote. She also wrote to her parents, frequently and at length, because she missed them with a specific, physical quality that she had not anticipated. She missed her father's study, and the sound he made when he found something interesting in his book. She missed her mother's worry, which she had spent years trying to manage, and now found she missed the way you miss something that was always just the shape of love, expressed in the only form available. She missed the kitchen, and the Thursday market, and the cheese seller who always had the sharp cheddar. She missed the river. She missed the particular light of an Ashwick morning, which was different from the light here, not better or worse, just different. The light of the place where you became yourself, rather than the place where you brought yourself to bear. William noticed the missing, not in the way that some people notice feelings, as problems to be solved or symptoms to be addressed, but in the way he noticed everything, with simple, quiet attention. He came to her one evening when she had been quiet all day, and said, "Tell me what you are thinking about." She said, "Home." He did not say that this was home now, which a smaller man might have said, which would have been both technically true and beside the point. He said, "Tell me about it." So she did. She told him about the study, and the cheese cellar, and the river, and the particular sound of the town on a Saturday morning, and all the small, specific things that made a place into the place where you had become yourself, and he listened, with the complete attention that was one of the things she had loved about him from the beginning, and when she had finished he said,
"We will go in the autumn."
She said, "You do not need to do that." He said, "I want to see where you come from. I want to understand those specific things." He paused, and then said, "Also, I want the cheese you are always describing." She laughed, genuinely, the full kind, and he smiled at the sound of it, and the evening settled around them with the warmth of two people who have found their way into something real, something that is made not of grand moments, but of these ones, the small, specific, honest ones that accumulate into a life. They went to Ashwick in October, as William had promised, and Eleanor found the town exactly as she had left it, and entirely different, because she was different, and the difference in her changed the way everything appeared. The streets were the same streets, and the river was the same river, and the oak tree at the end of the road had lost its leaves in the same gradual, annual way. But she moved through it now with a new quality in her body, not the quality of someone who belonged there, which she still did, but the quality of someone who also belongs elsewhere, which is a specific and not uncomplicated feeling, the feeling of being plural, of having more than one place that knows you. Her parents had prepared the house for their arrival with careful attention, her mother having spent at least 2 days ensuring that everything was as it should be, which Eleanor found deeply touching, and did not mention, because to mention it would have caused her mother to say it was nothing, when it was clearly not nothing. Her father shook William's hand in the entrance, and said he was glad to see him, and William said he was glad to be here, and they said these true and simple things to each other, and then went in. The visit lasted 4 days. On the first day, Eleanor walked the river path she had walked 1,000 times, with William beside her, and she showed him the specific bend in the river where the current moved in a particular way in autumn, and the spot on the bank where she had sat with Francis on the morning before the ball, and talked about everything except the ball. He listened to everything she pointed out with genuine attention, asking questions that showed he was building a picture, not of Ashwick in the abstract, but of Eleanor inside it, which was what he was actually interested in. On the second day, she took him to the market. The cheese seller recognized her immediately and greeted her with the warmth of a man who was completely unimpressed by titles and very glad to see a person he liked. He gave Eleanor the sharp cheddar without being asked and gave William a piece to try, and William tried it and said it was very good, and the cheese seller said yes it was, and showed no signs of being particularly moved by the presence of a duke in his stall, which Eleanor found entirely perfect. William bought 3 blocks and said he would like to know whether the man ever sold by correspondence, and the cheese seller said he had never tried that, but did not see why not, and they arrived at an arrangement on the spot that seemed to satisfy both of them. On the 3rd day, Frances came. Eleanor had told her the visit would happen, and Frances had prepared for it in the way Frances prepared for things, which was by deciding exactly what she thought and how she wanted to say it. She came in the afternoon, and Eleanor introduced them, and Frances looked at William with the direct, assessing gaze she brought to everyone she met, and William looked back with the calm of someone who had expected exactly this, and was not troubled by it. They talked for about 10 minutes on their own, the 2 people who loved Eleanor best, while Eleanor was occupied with her mother in the next room, and she did not know what was said, but when she came back, Frances's expression had shifted from assessor to something warmer, and William had the look of a man who has passed an examination he cared about. She asked Frances about it later, when they were alone for a few minutes. Frances said, "He knows who you are. Not just what you are, but who. The specific you. The one I have known all along." She said this with the simplicity of a woman stating a fact. Then she said, "He also has a very direct way of looking at people that I find bracing and appropriate. I approve of him." Eleanor said she was very glad. Frances said, "You should be. He is the right one. I could have told you that from the first evening, if you had asked me." Eleanor said, "You did not tell me." Frances said, "You needed to find out yourself. That was always going to be the only way it counted." On the 4th day, the morning of their departure, Eleanor sat in her father's study for an hour before the carriage came. She sat in the old green chair, the one that had been in the room her whole life, and she looked at the books and the shelves and the desk and the particular quality of the light in that room, which had been the first place she had understood that ideas were something you could live in, that the life of the mind was a real life and not a consolation prize. She held the room in her attention the way she would hold anything she was about to leave, wanting to carry it fully. Her father came in and sat at his desk and did not say anything for a moment, just sat there the way he had always sat there, with his quiet, steady quality that she had been given enough to spend a lifetime in. Then he said, "Are you well, up there?" She said, "I am very well." He said, "Is it what you wanted?" She thought about the question honestly. She said, "It is more than I knew to want, which is the best kind." He said that he thought that was right. He said that he had always known she was going to end up somewhere worthy of her, and that he was glad he had lived to see it. He said the last part quickly, in the way he said things that mattered, quickly and plainly, and then he picked up his book, not because he was done talking, but because he had said what he wanted to say and was satisfied. She got up and she put her hand on his shoulder briefly as she passed, and he put his hand over hers briefly, and then she went to finish the packing, and to find William, and to begin the journey back north, toward the life that was now hers, in all its complexity and all its promise. The carriage pulled away from the house on the gray October morning, and Eleanor looked back once, through the window, at the front of the house with its familiar face, and she saw her mother at the door, with her hand raised in the particular way she had of waving goodbye, arm up and hand open, as if she were not just saying farewell but holding something up toward the person who was leaving, offering it, making sure it could be seen. Eleanor raised her hand back, and the carriage rounded the corner, and the house was gone. She faced forward. William was beside her, and the road went north, and the landscape unfolded ahead of them, with all its bigness, the hills and the sky, and the long, serious distances of the north, and she was going home. Both places were home. This was something she had worked out, in the night, sometime during the visit, lying awake in the room she had slept in her whole life. You did not leave a home by finding another. You became someone who carried more than one. The room above the study, the father with his book, the river path and the cheese cellar, and Frances with her precise and loyal attention. All of this was in her, and would stay in her, not as something lost, but as something held, the foundation that everything else was built on. And ahead of her, the house in the north that she was learning room by room and field by field, the people whose lives touched hers and whose needs she was genuinely trying to meet. The husband beside her who was the right kind of person in every way that actually mattered. The life that had not been predicted for her, and that she had arrived at anyway. by the simplest possible means. She leaned slightly against William's shoulder. He did not comment on it. He simply shifted fractionally, the way you shift to accommodate someone you have become accustomed to having beside you, and they traveled on, through the October morning, toward everything that was still ahead. 3 years into the life at Aldenmere, Eleanor stood at the window of the room she had claimed as her own working space. A room at the northeast corner of the house, with a view over the kitchen garden, and, beyond it, the first of the fields that belonged to the estate. She had made the room her own, in the gradual way that she made most things her own, not dramatically, but with the patient accumulation of what was hers. The desk from the house in Ashwick that her father had sent north, with specific instructions about its care. The shelves she had filled with books that were now organized in the system she had developed, which made sense to her completely and baffled everyone else. And the small leather notebook on the windowsill, a new one now, the third since the first years at Aldenmere, the previous 2 full. She had been working. She had been working, in fact, since about 6 in the morning, which was her habit in the mornings, when the house was still quiet and the light came in, with a clean, early quality that she found good for thinking. She was going through the previous year's records for 3 of the tenant farms, comparing them against the 5 years before, looking for a pattern that the steward had mentioned and that she wanted to understand for herself before deciding what it meant and what, if anything, should be done about it. She had always found, in the years at Aldenmere, that the understanding had to come before the decision, and that the understanding required going back to the numbers herself, rather than receiving summary from someone else, not because she distrusted the steward, who was excellent, but because the direct encounter with the information produced a quality of understanding that summary could not replicate. This was how she had approached everything at Aldenmere, directly, and with her own attention. She had been told, early on, that her role was to oversee and to manage, which she took to mean understand and be responsible, which she took to mean actually know, rather than know in the second-hand way of someone who has been told and chosen to believe. The estate had responded to this approach with something she could only call trust, which was not a word that estate management literature typically used, but which was, she had found, the most accurate description of what had developed over 3 years of showing up and paying attention and doing what she said she would do. She had also, in those 3 years, made mistakes. She had misjudged a situation in the first winter, and it had cost the estate an unnecessary expense that she had absorbed without excusing herself to anyone, including William, who had heard about it later, and said only that everyone made that particular mistake once, and that once was the appropriate number. She had in the first autumn said something to one of the older tenants that she had intended as practical, and that had been received as dismissive, and she had found out about it through Mrs. Dalloway, who told her with the careful directness of a woman who had decided Eleanor was worth telling the truth to, and Eleanor had gone to the tenant herself, and said she had expressed herself badly, and was glad to be told. The tenant had looked at her for a long moment, the particular long moment of someone deciding whether to believe what they are being told, and then he had said that it was all right, and they had moved on, and after that, something in the quality of their interactions had changed, becoming warmer and more direct, the kind of relationship that has been tested and held. She had learned, through the accumulation of these experiences, what it actually meant to be responsible for people. Not the abstract responsibility of a title, not the understood from a distance responsibility that she had tried to prepare for before she arrived, but the specific, daily, concrete responsibility of people, whose difficulties were real, and whose circumstances were connected to decisions she made. She had found this weight not crushing but defining. It had given her work a quality of meaning that she had not experienced before in quite the same way, and she had found, unexpectedly, that she was good at carrying it, not because it was easy, but because she approached it honestly, and because she cared, and because she had learned that those 2 things, honesty and care, were the foundation of everything else that could be built in this kind of work. William came into the room around 9, carrying 2 cups of tea with the slightly careful quality of a tall man in a doorway. He set one on her desk and looked at what she was working on, and said, "The Eastern Farms." She said, "The pattern in the yields over 6 years." He said, "What are you finding?" She said, "That the pattern the steward identified is real, but that the cause is different from what he thought. It is not the soil, at least not primarily. It is the drainage in the low section, which affects 3 farms, rather than the 2 he identified. He sat on the edge of the desk and looked at the numbers she had laid out and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are right. I should have looked at this more carefully when Thompson mentioned it." She said, "You were dealing with the fence dispute in October." He said, "Still." She said, "The drainage can be fixed before autumn planting if we begin in August. I have some thoughts about how to approach it that I would like to go through with Thompson this week." He said, "I would like to be in that conversation." She said, "Good, I would like you to be." This was how they worked, not one directing and the other implementing, not one managing and the other supporting, but genuinely together, each bringing what they were best at, consulting each other not as a courtesy but as a necessity, because what they each understood was different and both understandings were required. She had come to think that this was what a good partnership actually looked like, not 2 people doing the same thing, but 2 people whose different ways of knowing a problem were genuinely complementary, producing together something that neither would have found alone. Lady Cavendish came to stay in summer, as had become her annual pattern. The visits had changed in character over the 3 years, the stiffness of the first year giving way to something more real, something that was not quite the warmth of a naturally close relationship, but was the warmth of 2 people who had found a genuine respect for each other across a significant initial difference. Lady Cavendish watched the way Eleanor managed the estate, and she did not say much about it directly, but she asked questions that showed she was paying attention, and when Eleanor answered, she listened in the close, interested way of someone who is revising their picture of the world with new information. On one occasion, in the 3rd summer, she said, without prelude and with the characteristic directness she had apparently passed on to her son, that Aldenmere had not been managed this well since her husband was alive. "Eleanor received this," she said. "That is a significant thing to say." Lady Cavendish said, "I say significant things when they are accurate." Eleanor said, "Then I am very glad to hear it." They looked at each other across the small table in the garden room where they had been having tea, and Eleanor felt, in that moment, the completion of something that had been in progress since the dinner at Lord Ashby's house, the careful, mutual work of 2 people who had begun from a position of distance and had, through the patient accumulation of real experience together, arrived somewhere genuinely different. Frances visited in the 2nd year, and the 3rd, each time staying for a week at Eleanor's insistence and spending the time writing, because Eleanor had made her a comfortable room with a desk and a view, and had told her she could do whatever she liked in it, which Frances had taken to mean exactly what it said. Frances had by then become a regular contributor to the publication her father ran, and was also writing for a more widely distributed periodical in the city, which Eleanor had told her was exactly what she had always known would happen. And Frances had said she hoped Eleanor was not about to say, "I told you so." And Eleanor had said she was absolutely going to say that. And Frances had laughed, the full kind. And they had sat together in the garden, and the summer had gone on around them in its generous way. In the 3rd year, Eleanor discovered she was expecting a child. She told William on an evening in late spring, in the garden room, with the last of the light coming through the long windows and laying itself across the floor in quiet gold stripes. She told him simply and directly, as she told him everything, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something she had not expected. He said, "I am very glad, and I also want to say that nothing about the way we do things here needs to change because of this, not unless you want it to." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean that you have built something here that is yours, in the full sense, not because it came with my name, but because you have made it what it is. I do not want you to feel that this changes the terms of that. You are not going to stop being the person who manages the eastern farms, and knows the tenants, and reorganizes the library, and argues with Thompson about drainage. You are going to be all of that, and also a mother, and it will require more of you. But I do not think you are a person who is unable to meet the demands of a larger life." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "That is perhaps the most precisely accurate thing you have ever said to me." He said, "I try to be precise." She said, "You always are." She paused, and then she said, "I am glad too, very glad." The child came in January, a boy, and they named him George, after her father, which was her idea, and which William agreed to without needing to be asked twice. She held the baby in the first hours, and felt the particular, unreadable enormity of that experience. the full weight of a new person's existence, beginning and being held in your hands. She had known, in the abstract, that this was going to be large. She had not known the specific quality of largeness it would turn out to be, the way it rearranged everything from the inside, not replacing anything, but adding a new dimension to all of it. Her mother came from Ashwick and stayed for a month, and for the first week she simply held the baby whenever Eleanor was not feeding him, with the particular expression of a woman who has been given something she did not know how much she wanted. Eleanor watched her mother hold George and felt a full and complicated love for her. The love that includes all the complicated history and does not require that history to have been different in order to be real. Her father came too, for the second week, and he sat in the chair by the window with the baby on his knee and read to him in the quiet, even voice he had used when he read to Eleanor, and Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked at this and thought that continuity was a kind of miracle, the way things pass from person to person through time, the way the things that formed you become part of what you give to the next person who arrives in your life, needing things to be formed by. She wrote in her notebook that night, after the house was quiet and the baby was sleeping, and William was beside her, already gone to rest. She wrote about what it meant to arrive somewhere, and then to find that arriving was not the end of the story, but the beginning of the next part. She wrote about how she had spent years thinking of her life as a problem to be solved, a situation to be navigated, a standard to be met by someone who had been told she fell short of it, and how the solving of it, or the not solving but the living of it, had turned out to involve simply showing up, honestly and repeatedly, and allowing the actual contents of who she was to do the work. She wrote that she was not the person the world had expected to be here. She wrote that she was exactly the person she had always been, in a life that had finally grown to fit her. She wrote that these were not contradictory. She closed the notebook. The room was dark and the house was quiet, and outside the windows, the January night was clear and still and cold, and somewhere in the house her son was sleeping the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone entirely new to the world. She lay in the dark, and she let the fullness of the life she had come to be in settle around her like something earned and real, and she felt, with the same simple and solid quality she had felt on the carriage ride back from Ashwick 3 years earlier, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. It had taken considerable time for the world to catch up, not because someone had handed it to her. She had arrived here the way she had always arrived anywhere, by walking through the door as herself, without revision and without apology. She fell asleep. The night held the house. George slept. William slept. The estate lay in its winter quiet, and all through it, in the farms and the fields and the paths that Eleanor now knew as well as she had ever known the streets of Ashwick, things were going on in the ordinary way of things, when they are well tended and honestly looked after, which is quietly, and continuously, and well. Spring came again, and with it, the estate's familiar renewal, the fields turning from brown to the particular yellow-green of new growth, the hedgerows filling in, the long days returning with their northern amplitude, light until almost 10 at night. Eleanor walked with George in the mornings when the ground was dry enough, carrying him at first and then, later in the year, watching him walk with the uncertain, determined quality of someone learning that legs work. She had found, in the months of his life, that the things she had not expected motherhood to give her were as real as the ones she had anticipated. She had expected the love, which was total. She had not expected the particular quality of attention that came with watching someone new learn the world from the beginning, the way it refreshed her own sense of things, making ordinary details strange and therefore interesting again. William watched her with George in the way he watched everything she did, with the quiet attention that had been one of the first things she had noticed about him, that quality of actually seeing rather than merely looking. He said to her, one morning in the kitchen garden, when they had all three been outside, and George had spent 20 minutes examining a stone with the complete focus of a scientist, that she was a remarkable mother. He said it simply, not as a compliment, but as an observation, the way he said most things. She said, he makes it easy. He is interesting. William said, all children are interesting at this age. You are interesting back. That is the part that is not automatic. She thought about this. She said, I just try to take him seriously. William said, yes, I know. That is what I mean. George looked up from his stone at that moment, for no particular reason, and looked at them both with the wide, unconcerned attention of a 1-year-old. and then returned to his stone. And they both looked at him, and the morning went on. Her work at the estate continued, with the quality of something she had grown into, rather than grown past, which was a thing she had wondered about in the early years, whether the demands would eventually feel repetitive, or the novelty would wear away, and leave only the obligation. It had not worked that way. The work had deepened rather than flattened, because the understanding she had built over 3 years made the problems more interesting rather than less. The way expertise does not simplify the thing you are expert in, but reveals its complexity more fully. She had become, without quite deciding to, someone the county turned to for opinion on certain matters of land management, which had happened gradually, through the specific reputation that comes from doing things well, and being willing to talk plainly about how. She received these approaches with the same quality she brought to everything else, not with the inflated self-importance of someone who has been told they are significant, but with the engaged interest of someone who finds the problem genuinely worth working on. She had never changed her fundamental way of being in a room, not since the evening she had stood at the window at Ashby House, and said she was using the garden as a surface on which to think. She brought herself, entirely, to every situation, and the situations, over the years, had expanded to meet the size of what she brought. Frances's writing had expanded too, in the years that had passed. She had published a small book, a collection of her columns, and some longer essays, and Eleanor had received her copy, with the specific joy of someone who had watched a thing becoming for years, and was now holding the result in her hands. She had read it in a day and a half, and written Frances a letter that was 6 pages long, which Frances had replied to saying that Eleanor's letter was the longest piece of sustained criticism she had received from anyone, and also the most useful, and that she was going to write more, and that Eleanor should already know that the dedication was to her. The dedication, which Eleanor read and reread several times, said simply, "To Eleanor, who knew before I did." She kept the book on the windowsill of her working room, next to the leather notebook. The combination of the two things, the book that was Frances being fully herself, and the notebook that was Eleanor being fully herself, was a thing she looked at sometimes in the early mornings, before the work of the day began, and she found it contained something she could not entirely put into words, but that was to do with what it meant to live honestly, to bring what you were fully into the things you did, to refuse the reduction of yourself into something more acceptable, and to find, when you held that refusal long enough, that the world did eventually make room. She wrote to her parents on a Thursday in late spring, the 4th year of her marriage, when the estate was at its best, and George was well, and William was somewhere out in the south field with the steward, and she had an hour at her desk before the afternoon's engagements. She wrote the way she always wrote to them, about the specific things, the real things, the cheese she had arranged to have sent up from Ashwick because William had become attached to it, and she had arranged the correspondence herself, the way George had said his first clear word 2 weeks before, which was not Mama or Papa, but was the name of the cat that lived in the kitchen, which told you something about his priorities. She wrote about the drainage project that had finally been completed and the results in the early growing of the eastern farms that confirmed what she had suspected from the numbers in her first winter. She wrote about Lady Cavendish's most recent visit and the conversation they had had in the garden room that had lasted 2 hours and covered 3 subjects she would never have predicted they could talk about, including one that had left them both laughing in the particular way of 2 people who have surprised each other. She wrote, at the end of the letter, that she was happy. She wrote it plainly, without elaboration, because it was a plain and unelaborated thing. She was happy, in the deep, solid way she had described to Frances at the kitchen table in Ashwick on the evening of the announcement. In the way that was not excitement, because excitement was temporary, and this was not temporary. In the way that was made of real things, specific things, the kind that accumulate into a life. She posted the letter and went back to her desk and looked at the numbers for the afternoon's meeting, and outside the window, the kitchen garden was green and full with the generous, indiscriminate productivity of late spring. And somewhere in the house, the cat whose name George had learned first was moving through the rooms with the calm authority of an animal who has decided this is its place, which it was, and the day went on around her, ordinary and real and entirely, completely hers. She was asked about it, the first time, by a young woman she had never met. This was in the 5th year of her marriage, at a gathering in the county that she attended with the regularity she brought to most things that were useful or interesting, which this one was, being an annual event that collected women from across the region for an afternoon of organized discussion on matters that affected their households and communities. Eleanor had been attending since her second year at Aldenmere, and had found, each time, that it was exactly the kind of gathering she had always wanted to exist in Ashwick, but which Ashwick had been too small and too comfortable in its habits to host. The young woman was perhaps 19, the daughter of a local merchant, with the particular combination of great intelligence and profound uncertainty that 19 often produces in women who have been smart enough to notice the limits of what they are being offered, and not yet experienced enough to know what to do about it. She had been sitting near Eleanor for most of the afternoon's formal discussion, and had, Eleanor noticed, been one of the few people in the room, asking questions that went directly to the center of the matter, rather than around it. At the end of the gathering, as people were collecting their coats and moving toward the door, she appeared beside Eleanor and said, with the direct courage of someone who has decided they are going to say a thing before they lose the nerve to say it, "May I ask you something?" Eleanor said yes. The young woman said, "How did you do it?" Eleanor looked at her. She said, "Can you be more specific?" The young woman said, "People told you that you were not the right kind of person for the life you wanted. They said it in ways that were meant to settle the matter, and it did not settle the matter. I would like to know how." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She had thought about this question before, in her own private way, but she had not been asked it directly by someone else, and the direct asking of it produced a need for a specific answer, rather than the general thinking she had done on her own. She said, "I want to make sure I answer this correctly, so I am going to take a moment." The young woman said that was fine. Eleanor thought about the night before the ball, sitting at the window, making the small private decision. She thought about the conversations with Francis, the ones in the print shop and by the river and in the kitchen, years of conversations in which Francis had simply told her the truth, which was that she was remarkable, and that the failure to see it was the world's failure of vision. She thought about her father, in the study, saying that she had always been more than any of them had seen, and that this had always been true. She thought about the morning in December with the snow, standing at the window, watching the child turn with arms out in the white street. She thought about what it had meant to arrive at Aldenmere and stand on the drive and feel the right size of a place for the first time. She said, "There are two parts to it, and I want to be honest about both." The young woman waited. Eleanor said, "The first part is that I was lucky, not in the outcome, not exactly, but in having people around me who told me the truth about myself when the world was telling me something different. A father who spoke to me as if my thoughts were worth taking seriously, from the time I was small enough that it was the only model I had. A friend who said, plainly and repeatedly, that the people finding me insufficient were wrong, and that it was their mistake and not mine. You cannot build yourself against the whole of a world that has decided against you, without someone, at least one person, who is telling you what you actually are. I had that. Not everyone has it. If you do not have it, finding it is the first task, because everything else is harder without it." The young woman was listening with the close, full attention of someone taking in information they need. Eleanor said, "The second part is this. There came a point where I decided, not easily, and not once, but many times, that being myself was not a compromise, that it was the only available honest path. I had spent years trying to understand what was required of me in order to be acceptable, and I had found that the requirements kept shifting and were not coherent, and that the life I would live if I met them was not a life I recognized as mine. So I stopped, not with a declaration, not with drama. I simply stopped adjusting myself toward an acceptability that was being defined by people whose judgment I had, on reflection, no particular reason to trust." She paused and then said, "This sounds simpler than it was. It was not simple. Every time someone said I was not the right kind of person for the life I wanted, there was a part of me that felt it. And I would be dishonest if I told you that part eventually stopped feeling. It did not. What changed was that the feeling stopped directing my behavior. That is a different thing from not feeling it." The young woman said, "How did you make that change? Between the feeling and the doing?" Eleanor thought about it. She said, slowly and imperfectly, and by noticing, each time, that the people who had the most confident opinions about my limitations were not, in fact, the most reliable judges, that they were operating from their own assumptions and from the templates their world had given them, and that my life was not required to be legible within those templates in order to be a real and good life, she said. And by deciding that I would rather be wrong while being myself than be wrong while being a version of myself, designed to please people who were using the wrong measure. The young woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Were you afraid?" Eleanor said, "Yes. Not all the time. But yes. Mostly I was afraid that I was wrong about myself, which is a different fear from being afraid of what other people thought. The external fear, I found I could manage. The internal one, the fear that perhaps they were right, and I was insufficient, in some real way, that I was not able to see. That one took longer." She said, "What resolved it was doing things. Going to the events, having the conversations, managing the estate, doing the actual work of the actual life, and discovering that I was capable of it. Capability is a very effective answer to self-doubt. You cannot argue with it, because it is not an argument, it is a fact." The young woman nodded. She looked like someone who had heard what they needed to hear. Not all of it, because you cannot give someone all of what they need in a doorway at the end of an afternoon, but enough of it to carry forward and build on. She said, "Thank you. That is very honest." Eleanor said, "It is the only version worth giving." The young woman thanked her again, and went to find her coat, and Eleanor watched her go, and felt something that was connected to the old feeling, the feeling of being the young woman in the doorway of a gathering, full of intelligence and full of uncertainty, understanding that the world had decided something about her, and not yet knowing how to decide something back. She felt it, and she felt the distance between that woman and who she was now, and the distance was real, and the years in it were real, and the work of it was real, and she did not sentimentalize it. She did not pretend it had been easy, or that she had been fearless, or that the path had been obvious. It had been none of those things. But she was here. She had arrived, not because the world had relented, though in many ways it had, the world being generally more willing to revise its opinions when presented with sufficient evidence, but because she had kept being herself long enough for the evidence to accumulate. William was waiting for her outside, because he had driven her, and had walked the grounds of the estate nearby during the gathering. He saw her expression when she came out and said, "What happened?" She said, "A young woman asked me how I did it." He said, "What did you tell her?" She said, "The truth, as best as I could give it." He said, "Which part?" She said, "That the key is deciding to keep being yourself, after everyone has told you that you are the wrong kind of self, and that this is harder than it sounds, and that it takes longer than it should, and that it works." He said, "Does it always work?" She said, "I cannot speak to always. I can speak to my experience, which is that it did." He said, "That seems like the honest scope." She said, "It is." They walked to the carriage. The afternoon was warm, and the air had the quality of late spring in the north, clean and slightly sharp, with the smell of new growth coming from the fields. She got in and he got in, and the horse began the familiar route home, through the lanes that she knew now as well as she had ever known the streets of Ashwick, and she looked at the landscape going past and felt the full present weight of the life she was in. She thought about the young woman in the doorway, full of intelligence and full of uncertainty, and she hoped that something she had said would find the right place and stay there. She hoped the young woman had someone, at least one person, who told her the truth about herself. She hoped the young woman would find, at whatever age it happened and in whatever form it came, the thing that Eleanor had found at the window before the ball, the decision, small and private and complete, to arrive as yourself, and let that be the only thing you offer. She thought about what she would say if she could speak to the woman she had been before that night. The young Eleanor in the room in Ashwick, sitting with her candle and her book, looking at the window, knowing that the world had already decided something about her, and not yet having fully decided what she thought about the world's decision. She would say, "You are exactly right to be unconvinced. The world is measuring you against a template it did not make for people like you, and your failure to fit it is not evidence of your insufficiency. It is evidence of the template's limitation. You are going to go to that ball. You are going to go as yourself, entirely yourself, and it is going to feel like a small thing when you decide it, like a private decision that no one outside the room will ever know you made, and it is going to turn out to be the most important decision of your life, not because of what it produces, not because of the duke or the house or the title that will come after it, but because of what it means to make it. because of what you become in the moment of making it. A woman who has decided, against all available evidence to the contrary, that she is enough, that she has always been enough, that the right response to a world that insists on finding you insufficient is not to become something different, but to remain so completely and so honestly yourself that the world is eventually forced to revise its assessment. She would say, "You will feel it in your bones before anyone else confirms it. Trust that feeling. It is the truest thing available to you. Keep being what you are. Keep being it in rooms that have decided against you, and in conversations that do not make room for you, and in years that look like they are going to keep being what they have always been. Keep being it, because it is the only honest path, and honest paths are slower and harder and more real than the alternatives, and the realness of them is what you will be glad of later." She would say, "You are going to arrive, not where you expected, somewhere better, somewhere the size of what you actually are, and you are going to stand in the drive of that life, and you are going to say, not in words but in the way your body settles into the place, this is exactly the right size, and you are going to be right." The carriage moved through the spring afternoon, and the fields went by, and the house came into view in the distance, the old stone catching the light, the gardens at their greenest, the paths she had walked hundreds of times winding between the ordered beds. George would be awake from his rest by now, and Mrs. Dalloway would have him in the kitchen where she always had him in the afternoons, and the cat would be nearby, and the house would be making the sounds a house makes when it is full and well and going about its life. Eleanor looked at it coming toward her, and felt, in her chest, the clean and solid warmth of a woman who has come home. Not to the place where she was born, though she would always love that place, and always miss it, but to the life that was the right size, to the work that was worthy of her, and the person who saw her, and the years stretching out ahead, full of difficulty, and ordinary days, and unexpected joys, and the particular, irreplaceable satisfaction of a life that is genuinely yours. The carriage stopped. She got down. The afternoon air met her, warm and clear, and she stood in the drive for a moment, the way she had stood the very first time she arrived, and she looked at the house and the trees and the sky above the hills. Then she walked toward the door. She walked exactly as herself, as she always had, as she always would. And the door opened, and she went in, and the life that was hers continued with her inside it, real and good and entirely, completely hers. There is not a single grander entrance that she could have made. There is not a version of this story where she arrived differently, dressed differently, presented herself differently, and found the same result. The result, in all its fullness, in all the specific, detailed reality of it, was produced by one thing only, the decision to be entirely herself, made quietly, at a window, on the night before the ball, and kept every single day that followed. That was the beginning. That was also, in the most important sense, the whole of it. Everything else was consequence, the long, rich, real consequence of a woman who had decided, once, to trust herself, and then gone on trusting herself every day until the world caught up with what she had always known. The world, in time, did catch up. It always does, when you give it enough to catch up to. And she had given it everything. The years after the 5th year were not simple years. They were years of the kind that life produces when you have committed to something real, full of the ordinary difficulty of real things, seasons that brought drought to 2 of the farms, and required decisions that kept her and William and the steward in conversation for most of a summer, finding solutions that were fair and practicable, and that did not leave anyone behind who could be helped. There was an illness that went through the household one winter, the cold kind that settled in and would not move quickly, and Eleanor managed the weeks of it with the same quality she brought to everything, present and practical, and refusing to pretend it was less than it was, while also refusing to allow it to become more than it was. George had a period in his 4th year that required a kind of patient, steady engagement she had not been prepared for, and that she gave, because there was no alternative she found acceptable, and she came through it, having learned something specific about herself that she had not known before, about the particular kind of stubbornness that love produces, and that she was apparently made of more than she had realized. Lady Cavendish died in the 7th year of Eleanor's marriage, in the summer, in the room at Aldenmere that had been hers for 30 years, in the way that a woman of her character dies, which was with full knowledge of what was happening, and without making it into an event beyond what it actually was. Eleanor was with her. She had been spending the last weeks of Lady Cavendish's life in the house, in an increased way, not managing her, because Lady Cavendish did not require managing, but simply being present, because she understood that this was what was needed, and because she found, to her genuine feeling, that she wanted to be there, not from obligation, but from the specific, real care that had developed over 7 years of gradual, honest work between two women who had begun from a position of significant misalignment. Lady Cavendish said to her, in one of the last conversations they had, that she had been wrong in the very beginning, and that she was glad of it. Eleanor said she was glad too, because being wrong in the beginning had led to the revising, which had led to this, meaning the conversation they were having, and the relationship it represented, and that she would not exchange it for a version in which the beginning had been easier. Lady Cavendish said, with the precision she had never lost, that this was a very Eleanor way of looking at it. Eleanor said she was a very Eleanor person, and Lady Cavendish smiled, in the way she had only begun to smile since about the 3rd year, the full kind rather than the controlled kind, and Eleanor held her hand, and they sat together in the old room, with the summer light coming through the curtains in long, warm bars, and they did not need to say very much more. When she was gone, Eleanor felt the loss as a genuine loss, not only for William, whose grief was real and present, and which she sat with him in without trying to replace it with comfort it was too early to offer, but as her own, the specific loss of a person who had been in her life in a significant way, and who was now not. She wrote about it in the notebook. She wrote that loss was the side of love that was not visible until you had loved something long enough to lose it, and that the capacity for the loss was made by the years of the love, and that she did not regret a single year of the slow, difficult, genuinely arrived at love she had developed for William's mother, because the loss was its own kind of proof of how real the love had been. She went on. The estate went on. George grew. 2 more children came, a daughter they called May, for the month she was born, and for the season that was Eleanor's favorite, and then a second son, who they named after no one in particular, just a name they both liked, which was Henry, and he turned out to be the loudest and most energetically curious of the 3, which was saying something. The work of the estate deepened, as work deepens, when you have done it long enough to understand it fully. She found, in the 8th and 9th and 10th year, that she had become someone the county recognized, not as the Duke's wife, who managed things unusually well, but simply as someone who managed things well, the distinction falling away, because the evidence of the thing itself had become sufficient. This was something she had not aimed for, and did not make into an achievement she spoke about. It was simply what happened when you showed up honestly, and kept working. The world updated its picture of you. It was slow, and it was incomplete, and it was never entirely finished, because there was always someone who had not yet received the update, and was still operating on the old picture. But it happened, largely, and the update, when it came, was accurate. She was 35 years old when she received the letter from the publisher in the city, asking whether she would be willing to write something, for a women's periodical that was beginning, about what it meant to manage an estate of the size and complexity of Aldenmere, from the perspective of a woman who had come to it without the traditional preparation. The letter was carefully worded, respectful of her time, clear about what was being asked. She read it twice. She thought about it for 2 days. She wrote back and said yes. The piece she wrote was 5,000 words long, and was more personal than she had intended when she started it, and more honest than she had expected to be comfortable with when she finished it. It talked about the arrival, the years of learning, the mistakes she had made, and what she had taken from them. It talked about what it meant to be in a role that the world had not designed, with someone like her in mind, and to do the work of the role anyway, not in the performance of suitability, but in the genuine commitment to the substance of it. It talked about the drainage project in the East Farms, which she described in specific technical detail, because she thought the specific technical detail was important, because it was important that anyone reading understood that this was real work, not the ceremonial version, not the decorative version. It talked about the young woman in the doorway at the 5th-year gathering, though without identifying her, because that conversation had stayed with Eleanor, and she wanted to answer it more fully than the doorway had allowed. She did not talk about the ball, not directly. She did not need to. The piece was the answer to the question the ball had posed, which was, what becomes of a woman who arrives as herself in a world designed to expect someone else? The answer was this. The answer was all of it. The work, and the learning, and the losses, and the children, and the years, and the life. Genuinely and fully lived, in the only form she had ever been willing to live it, which was her own. Frances read the piece when it was published and wrote Eleanor a letter that was even longer than the 6-page one Eleanor had written her, and which said, among other things, that Eleanor had always had this to say, and that she was glad it had found its way into print, and that she hoped there was more coming. Eleanor wrote back and said there probably was. Her mother read it, in a copy that Eleanor sent specifically. Her mother wrote back and said that she was proud, and she said it in the direct and unelaborated way that Eleanor had written the piece, which was the way Eleanor had always hoped her mother would find, and which her mother had found, slowly and honestly, in the years of watching her daughter be who she was. Her father wrote nothing, because he was not a man who wrote long letters, but he sent her, in the same envelope as her mother's letter, a small pressed flower from the garden at Ashwick, with his name written on a card beneath it, and she knew exactly what it meant. She put the card in the notebook. She put the flower between the pages. She sat at her desk in the northeast room, with the view over the kitchen garden, and she held the weight of all of it, the life she was in, and the life she had come from, and the young woman who had sat at a window one autumn night and made a small, private, entirely consequential decision about who she was going to be. She was still that woman. Everything had changed, and she was still exactly that woman. The one who had walked into a room and been herself without apology and without performance, and had found, against all the predictions of everyone who had decided to predict, that this was exactly sufficient. More than sufficient. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. She picked up her pen. Outside, the kitchen garden was going about its spring business with the industrious, indifferent energy of things that grow. Beyond it, the fields. Beyond the fields, the hills, the whole of the estate going on in its real and demanding, and genuinely worth-tending life. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Then she wrote, "Today was an ordinary day," which is to say it was full. She wrote for a while longer. Then she put down the pen and looked out the window and was glad. Not in the simple way, in the deep, solid way. The way she had described to Frances at the kitchen table all those years ago, in Ashwick, on the evening everything had just become real. In the way that was not excitement, but was built of something more permanent. In the way that was made of exactly the life she was actually living, which was hers, which was real, which was the right size, which was entirely, finally, completely enough. She had always been enough. It had just taken the world a little time to understand that. She had given it the time. She had remained, entirely herself, for all of it. And here she was. Here she was,